The house settles into quiet most nights around this time, and tonight I hope it does the same for you. Before we go anywhere else, let's just sit for a moment in a place far from here in a small farming village not far from the coast of southern England on a morning in the late summer of 1348. Somewhere in that village, a household is about to discover that someone they love will not survive the week. This is a story about the year the world learned that death could arrive without warning, spreading faster than anyone could run from it, and that no wall, no wealth, and no prayer offered any real protection. Historians estimate that within a handful of years, something close to one person in every 3 across the whole of Europe will die from what is coming. The exact number is still debated, because the record-keeping of the 14th century was never built to count a catastrophe this large, but even the most careful conservative estimates that describe a wound that has never fully closed in human memory. Let me bring you inside one house on that morning so the scale of it has a face. A young man named Thomas lives in that village, a labourer who works another family's fields for a share of the harvest each year. He is not wealthy, not important in any way. History usually notices only ordinary, the kind of person whose name would never have survived 7 centuries if not for what happens to him next. On this particular morning, he does not stir when his mother calls him. She calls a second time gently, the way you call someone who has simply overslept. There is no answer. When she climbs the ladder to where he sleeps, she finds him burning with fever, his skin damp against the straw, a swelling already rising beneath one arm that had not been there the evening before. He had gone to bed complaining only of tiredness, a little more tired than usual after a long day in the fields, nothing anyone would have thought twice about. By morning, something inside him has changed entirely, and neither he nor his mother yet has a name for what it is. Outside the village goes on exactly as it always has, because none of them know yet that anything has changed. Chickens are let out into the yard. A neighbour leads 2 oxen toward a strip of barley, waiting to be brought in before the weather turns. Smoke rises thin and steady from a dozen chimneys, and somewhere a dog barks at nothing in particular. Down the lane a woman kneads bread with flour dusted across her forearms, humming something half-remembered from her own mother, and a child chases a chicken that has wandered too close to the well. It is by every visible measure a morning like any other, the kind of morning that leaves no trace in any record precisely because nothing about it seems worth recording. The parish priest walks toward the small stone church to ring the bell for morning prayer, unaware that within a season he will be ringing that same bell so often for so many burials that he will eventually lose count, and later still, that there will be no one left with the strength to ring it at all. None of them yet understand that a ship has already docked weeks earlier at a port along the southern coast carrying something far smaller than anything they could imagine and far more dangerous than any army that has ever crossed into England. Within 3 days, Thomas will be dead. Within 3 weeks, so will nearly a third of the people in his village. And within 2 years, this same quiet, unremarkable morning will repeat itself in farmhouses and palaces, in fishing villages and great cathedral towns from the Mediterranean coast to the edge of Scandinavia, until entire regions of Europe stand nearly empty, their fields left unharvested, because there is no one remaining who is well enough to bring them in. What is strange listening back across nearly 7 centuries is how little warning anyone actually received. There was no gathering army on a distant horizon, no herald riding ahead to announce what was coming. There was only a slight rise in strange illness reported from a nearby town. A handful of merchants who fell sick after a journey, a few deaths that seemed at first like nothing more than the usual toll of a hard season. It crept in through doorways that were never locked against it, because no one yet knew this was a door that needed locking. Distance did not save you, wealth did not save you. A castle's walls did not save you, and neither did the walls of a great cathedral, not reliably, not in the end. Kings and beggars alike would come to learn this in the months ahead, often within the same week, sometimes within the same house. We are going to spend the hours ahead moving slowly through what happened next, not to frighten you with it, but to actually understand it the way you might sit beside someone who lived through something enormous and simply ask them gently to tell you what it was truly like. We will follow this disease backward along the trade routes that first carried it out of Central Asia, long before anyone in a small English village had reason to fear it. There is a siege at a Black Sea trading post, years before Thomas ever falls ill, that some historians believe may have been the very moment this disease first crossed into a European ship's hold, a detail so strange and so specific that it reads more like invention than history, though the evidence for it is real. We will walk through the port cities where it first touched European soil and the roads and rivers that carried it onward from there, sometimes moving no faster than a person could walk, sometimes leaping ahead by weeks along a single trading vessel. We will spend time with the physicians of the age who tried using everything medieval medicine understood to explain an illness that defied every framework available to them, and who reached for remedies that now seem strange to us, though they were offered in genuine desperation. And later we will turn to what modern science, working directly with the bones of the dead themselves, has finally been able to confirm about what this disease truly was, and exactly how it moved through a body, a household, a town. Some of what we will find is settled fact agreed upon by nearly every historian working in this field. Some of it is not. Even now, scholars still debate how the disease first crossed into Europe, whether it travelled by a single route or several at once, and how many of the deaths attributed to it were caused by this illness alone, rather than the famine and violence that so often followed in its wake. Chroniclers of the time left behind vivid, sometimes contradictory accounts, written by monks and merchants who were often burying their own families as they wrote, and modern historians have spent decades trying to separate what those witnesses actually saw from what fear and grief led them to imagine. I will be honest with you about where that uncertainty lives, rather than pretending the past is tidier than it actually was. That honesty, I think, is part of what makes a true story worth staying awake a little longer for. Before we go further, if this is the kind of history you've been looking for, take a moment now to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps long, careful storytelling like this find its way to more people who might need it tonight. And if you have a moment, leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from and what drew you to this particular story. I always read them, and I am glad you are here. Now let yourself get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. Because to understand what happened to Thomas, and to the millions of people like him across an entire continent, we have to go back further than that August morning in England. We have to go back to a world that, for all its hardship, still believed itself relatively safe from anything on this scale. A world of walled cities and busy harbours of monasteries keeping careful records and markets trading in silk, spice, wool and grain. It was a world stitched together by trade routes stretching thousands of miles from the caravan cities of the east to the wool towns of the west, carried along by merchant sailors and travellers who had no way of knowing that the same roads binding their world together in prosperity were about to become the very channels through which its greatest catastrophe would travel. Something was already moving along those roads by the time Thomas fell ill in his family's small house on the edge of that English village. Something that had already crossed deserts and mountain ranges, already emptied towns half a world away, and was only now quietly arriving at Europe's door. Long before it had a name that would echo through 7 centuries, this disease was simply a rumour travelling faster than any person could carry. It whispered along a network of roads that had connected east and west for longer than anyone in Thomas's small English village could have imagined. To understand how something born in the grasslands of Central Asia ended up in the arm of a farm labourer in southern England, we have to think differently about distance than we usually do. The medieval world is often imagined as a patchwork of isolated kingdoms, each one closed off behind its own borders and its own concerns. The reality was far more connected. Silk moved from China to Constantinople. Spices moved from India through Persia and into Venice. Grain, wool, furs, and enslaved people moved along overland routes that stretched across steppe and desert, linking together a trading world so vast that a merchant in Genoa might handle goods that had passed through a dozen hands and a dozen languages before reaching him. This network is what modern historians call the Silk Road. Though it was never a single road at all, more a great web of routes, caravans, river crossings, and mountain passes that had carried goods, ideas, and unknowingly disease back and forth for more than 1,000 years before this particular outbreak began. Somewhere along that web, likely in the eastern reaches of what is now Central Asia, a bacterium that had lived quietly for centuries in the burrows of wild rodents found a new way to travel. Scholars still debate the exact point of origin, and the evidence remains genuinely incomplete, pieced together from tree ring data, burial records, and more recently, ancient genetic material recovered from human remains. What most researchers now agree on is the period of unusual climate disruption, likely a shift in rainfall and temperature across the grasslands of Central Asia, pushed populations of marmots and other burrowing rodents into closer contact with each other, and with the trade caravans passing through their territory. The fleas that lived on these rodents carried the bacterium in their gut, and when their usual hosts began dying off in unusual numbers, those fleas needed somewhere else to feed. This is one of the details that surprises people most when they first learn it. The disease that would eventually kill roughly a third of an entire continent did not begin with a person. It began with a flea, and before the flea with a rodent, and before the rodent with a change in weather patterns thousands of miles from where any of its human victims would ever set foot. There is something almost unbearably indifferent about that chain of cause and effect, a reminder that history's largest catastrophes sometimes begin in places too small and too far away for anyone alive at the time to notice, let alone prevent. Once the bacterium found its way into human populations along these trade routes, likely through the bite of an infected flea, or through contact with an infected animal, it began moving, the way everything else moved along the Silk Road, carried by the same caravans that carried silk salt and grain. A merchant falling ill in a caravan camp somewhere near the Tarim Basin had no way of knowing that his illness would eventually reach a small stone house on the edge of an English village. He likely never travelled more than a few hundred miles from where he was born, but the goods he carried, and eventually the fleas hidden in sacks of grain or the rats that travelled in the holds of ships, would travel much farther than any single person needed to. It helps to picture the mechanics of this world a little more closely, because the picture explains so much of what follows. A caravan moving along these routes might carry bolts of silk wrapped in coarse cloth sacks of grain destined for a distant market, bundles of furs, traded down from the northern forests, and among all of it, entirely unnoticed, the black rats that had learned to live wherever humans stored food. These rats travelled well. They tolerated the jostling of a cart or the hold of a ship far better than most other animals, and they thrived on the very grain that made the caravan trade worth undertaking in the first place. Wherever people carried food for profit, rats had learned to ride along for free, and the fleas that lived in their fur rode along with them. No customs official, no city gate, and no quarantine measure of the era was built with rats in mind. The entire economic engine of the 14th century, in other words, was quietly and unknowingly designed to carry this disease exactly where it needed to go. By the early 1340s, reports of a strange and violent illness begin appearing in the chronicles of Central Asian cities, and shortly afterward in the trading posts of the Crimean Peninsula, where routes from the east met the ports of the Black Sea. It is here, at a heavily fortified trading colony held by merchants from Genoa, that one of the most vivid and strange episodes in this entire history unfolds, and it is worth pausing on, because it captures something essential about how disease and human conflict became tangled together in ways that 14th century people could never have anticipated. The trading colony sits under siege by a Mongol army. One of many such conflicts common to the region at the time fought over trade rights and territory, rather than anything resembling the plague itself. But as the siege drags on, the disease begins moving through the besieging army, killing soldiers faster than any battle ever could. According to one surviving account written by a notary who may have witnessed the events himself, the attacking commander orders the bodies of the dead catapulted over the walls into the city in what may be one of the earliest recorded attempts at biological warfare in human history. Historians remain divided on how much credit to give this account. The chronicler wrote it years after the events he described, and some scholars suspect the story may have grown more dramatic with retelling the way stories often do when they pass through survivors trying to make sense of catastrophe. What is generally accepted, though, is that the disease was already present in the region regardless of the siege likely carried by rats and fleas that needed no catapult to cross a city wall, and that the merchants trapped inside eventually fled by ship carrying the illness with them, whether or not those particular bodies ever cleared the walls. Those ships sail west toward Constantinople, toward the islands of the Mediterranean, toward Italy, and with them travels something that no army, no fortification, and no amount of caution could have stopped, because almost no one on board yet understands what they are actually carrying. The Genoese merchants fleeing that trading colony are not careless people, nor are they foolish. They are frightened, exhausted, and desperate to reach home after months under siege, doing what any reasonable person in their position would do. Some of the sailors are already sick when the ship set out, though sickness on a long sea voyage was common enough in this period that it likely raised little immediate alarm. The Mediterranean in the 1340s was crossed constantly by the merchant vessels and illness among a returning crew. Even a serious one was not yet unusual enough to draw the kind of attention that hindsight makes it seem like it should have. I find myself thinking when I sit with this part of the story about how differently we understand cause and effect today compared to the people living through it. We now know with real scientific confidence that this disease was caused by a specific bacterium carried primarily by fleas living on black rats, moving alongside human trade and travel in ways that can be traced with remarkable precision, using both historical records and modern genetic evidence recovered from burial sites across Europe and Asia. The people boarding those ships in the 1340s understood almost none of this. They understood illness as something that could result from bad air, from divine punishment, from an imbalance of the body's natural humours, or from the deliberate malice of an enemy, whether human or otherwise. The idea that a flea, an animal too small to notice, might be responsible for emptying entire cities would have seemed absurd to them if the idea had occurred to anyone at all. This gap between what people understood at the time and what we understand now is not a story about ignorance. It is a story about how differently the past experienced its own catastrophes, forced to make sense of overwhelming loss, using only the tools their world had given them. And it is worth remembering as we move forward into the port cities where this disease first sets foot on European soil, because the physicians, priests, and ordinary people who meet it there are not fools. They are intelligent people doing their genuine best with an understanding of the natural world that simply had not yet caught up to what was happening around them. By the closing months of 1347, ships carrying this cargo of grain cloth and something far more dangerous begin arriving at ports along the eastern Mediterranean. Word travels ahead of them in fragments, second-hand accounts of entire cities emptied in the east of merchants who set out on journeys and never returned, of a strange and violent death that seemed to follow trade routes with an almost deliberate precision. Some of these stories reach Europe distorted by distance and fear, or exaggerated in the way rumours of distant catastrophe often are. Others, as it will soon become terribly clear, understate what is actually coming. A handful of ships are already crossing open water towards Sicily as autumn settles over the Mediterranean, their crews growing thinner and quieter with each passing week. The harbour officials waiting to receive them in the port of Messina have no reason yet for alarm, no warning beyond the ordinary rhythm of ships arriving and departing as they always have. They simply watch the horizon for the familiar shapes of sails the way they have watched it every autumn of their lives, with no way of understanding what those particular sails are about to bring ashore. Messina in the autumn of 1347 is a busy, prosperous harbour town, the kind of place that has grown wealthy on exactly the traffic it is about to receive. Grain ships, wool merchants, pilgrims bound for the Holy Land, all pass through its waters as a matter of routine. The dock workers who gather each morning to unload incoming vessels know the rhythm of this harbour the way a farmer knows the rhythm of a season, and nothing in that rhythm has prepared them for what arrives when several Genoese galleys finally sail into port. The ships are recognised immediately as trading vessels, the kind that regularly bring goods from the eastern Mediterranean. But something about them is wrong from the moment they are sighted. They move slowly, awkwardly, with too few hands visible on deck to properly manage the rigging. When they finally draw close enough to hail the harbour officials who approach them, find something that no one in Messina has words for yet. Most of the crew lying dead in the hold. The handful still alive are barely able to stand, their bodies marked with dark swellings at the neck armpit and groin swellings that weep and blacken the surrounding skin in a way that seems to defy every illness anyone in the port has ever encountered. Contemporary chroniclers writing in the years just after these events describe men who seem to carry death itself in their very breath. A description that reads today as understandable panic rather than medical precision, but which captures something true about how quickly this illness could move once it found a new host. The authorities in Messina do something that will become over the following months. One of the most consequential decisions of the entire outbreak, though, almost no one recognizes its significance at the time. They order the ships turned away, refusing to let the surviving crew disembark, driving the galleys back out to open water rather than allow this cargo of dying men into their city. It is in hindsight exactly the right instinct. It is also tragically far too late. The rats that had travelled in those ships' holds and the fleas that travelled on the rats had already found their way ashore before anyone in Messina understood what they were looking at. Within days, the first residents of the city begin falling ill with symptoms that mirror what the sailors displayed. By the time the city's leaders fully grasp what has arrived on their doorstep, it has already left the docks behind and moved into the streets, the markets, the homes of ordinary families going about their ordinary lives. What the people of Messina are witnessing, though they have no framework yet to understand it fully, is a disease capable of moving through a human body with a speed that outpaces almost every plague their world has previously known. Modern medical understanding, built from careful study of the bacterium responsible, describes at least 2 and possibly 3 distinct ways this illness could present itself, depending on how it entered the body. Most commonly, it arrived through the bite of an infected flea entering the bloodstream and lymphatic system, producing those characteristic swellings called buboes by physicians of the era within days of infection. Left untreated, this form killed roughly half of those it infected, sometimes fewer, sometimes considerably more, depending on factors medieval physicians had no way of measuring. A second rarer form entered the lungs, directly spreading, not through flea bites but through the air itself, passed from person to person in close quarters through coughing and laboured breathing. This form killed with even greater speed and even greater certainty in some cases within a single day of the first symptoms appearing. Scholars still debate how frequently this airborne form occurred, during the outbreak as a whole, since medieval accounts rarely distinguished clearly between the different presentations, but many historians believe it explains some of the accounts describing entire households dying within hours of one another, a pace of death that the flea-borne form alone struggles to fully account for. I think it's worth sitting with what this actually meant for the people living through it, rather than simply reciting the medical mechanics. Imagine waking up feeling only slightly unwell, the kind of tiredness that seems easily explained by a hard day's work or a poor night's sleep. By evening, a swelling has appeared somewhere on your body, tender and strange, unlike anything you have felt before. By the following morning you may already be gone, and the people who loved you, who sat beside you through the night trying every remedy their world had to offer, are left to bury you before the sun sets again, often digging the grave themselves because there is no longer anyone left whose profession it was to dig graves. This is not an exaggeration crafted for effect. It is close to the literal experience recorded in fragments and asides by chroniclers across Europe who lived through those months and tried in whatever way they could to leave some record of what they witnessed. The people of Messina understandably begin to flee. This response, so natural and so human, becomes one of the most tragically effective mechanisms by which the disease spreads across the rest of Sicily and eventually the Italian mainland. Families load what belongings they can carry and set out for the countryside, for relatives and other towns, for anywhere that feels safer than a city where death has arrived, without explanation. They do not know, because there was no way for them to know, that some among them are already carrying the infection, whether in their blood or in the fleas hidden in the folds of their clothing and the fur of the rats that inevitably travel wherever grain and desperate people travel together. Each departing family, moving with entirely reasonable fear toward what they hope is safety, becomes an unwitting vector carrying the disease outward along every road leading away from the city. There is a detail from this period that surprises many people when they first encounter it, something rarely mentioned outside of specialized historical accounts. The city of Messina, in the weeks following the ship's arrival, appeals to a nearby town for help managing the crisis, and that town's leadership, upon hearing what is happening, makes the difficult decision to seal itself off, entirely refusing entry to refugees fleeing Messina, regardless of their circumstances. This is very likely one of the earliest documented attempts at what we would now recognize as a deliberate quarantine measure enacted specifically against this disease, born not from any scientific understanding of how illness spreads, but from simple, desperate observation. People who came from Messina seemed to bring death with them. Therefore the town's leaders reasoned, keep those people out. It is a brutal decision by any modern ethical standard, and it likely condemned some innocent refugees to die outside city walls rather than within them. It is also in its crude and instinctive way closer to the correct response than almost anything else attempted elsewhere in Europe. During those early months, a strange, uncomfortable truth that historians studying the period's public health responses have had to reckon with. It would be many decades before European port cities developed anything resembling a formal system for managing arriving ships suspected of carrying disease, and when that system finally emerged, it grew directly out of hard lessons learned during outbreaks like this one. Ships arriving from suspect ports would eventually be required to wait offshore for a set period before their crews were allowed to disembark, a practice that would come to be known by a word borrowed from the length of that waiting period itself. In 1347, no such formal practice yet existed anywhere in Europe. What existed instead was raw improvisation, city officials making desperate, uncoordinated decisions based on whatever fragments of information and instinct they had available, with no shared body of knowledge to draw on and no time to develop one before the next ship appeared on the horizon. By the end of 1347, the disease has established itself firmly across Sicily, moving inland from Messina and outward along the coastline toward other port cities. Word of what happened there travels ahead of the disease itself. carried by merchant sailors and the general current of information that moved, however imperfectly, across medieval trade networks. Some of what reaches the mainland is accurate. Much of it is not, distorted by the natural tendency of catastrophic news to grow stranger and more exaggerated with each retelling, each teller adding a detail meant to convey the true scale of horror they had heard about but not personally witnessed. What almost no one in Italy yet understands as 1347 turns into 1348 is how little any of their preparation will actually matter. Messina's instinct to turn the ships away arrived too late to save the city itself, but the deeper lesson, the one that would have actually mattered, was one that 14th century medicine simply had no way of grasping. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how many separate ports and cities the disease entered through during this period, since it likely arrived by multiple routes nearly simultaneously rather than spreading from any single point of origin. Venice, Genoa, and other major trading centres each maintained their own extensive networks of ships and merchants passing constantly between the eastern Mediterranean and their own harbours, and the disease appears to have found several doors into Italy at nearly the same time rather than politely waiting to move from one city to the next in an orderly line. Genoa, itself the very city whose merchants had fled that besieged trading colony months earlier, receives its own share of infected ships not long after Messina's ordeal begins. The response there is in some ways even more forceful. Chroniclers describe the city's authorities driving away arriving vessels with flaming arrows, a detail so vivid it almost sounds invented. Though multiple independent accounts from the period describe similar defensive measures taken by port cities increasingly desperate to keep this cargo of death away from their harbours, it rarely worked for long. A ship denied entry to one port simply sailed to the next, carrying the same infected rats and the same doomed sailors, until somewhere along the coastline exhaustion, need for supplies, or simple bad luck allowed it to make landfall regardless of who tried to stop it. By the earliest months of 1348, the disease that had emptied a besieged trading colony on the Black Sea crossed the Mediterranean aboard ships nobody wanted to receive and established its first foothold in a Sicilian port city is no longer contained to any single harbour or coastline. It has begun moving inland, following the same roads and rivers that had once carried grain, wool and pilgrim, now carrying something else entirely toward the great cities of the Italian peninsula, cities whose crowded streets and busy marketplaces are about to become the setting for some of the outbreak's most devastating chapters. A's word of Sicily's suffering spreads northward through the Italian peninsula so quietly and far more effectively does the disease itself, moving not as a single advancing wave, but as a scatter of separate outbreaks, each one seeded by a different ship, a different merchant, a different infected traveller who had no idea what they carried with them. By the spring of 1348, the city of Florence, one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated urban centres in all of Europe, begins recording the same strange pattern of illness that had emptied the harbour town of Messina months earlier. Florence at this moment is a city of remarkable achievement, its wool trade and banking houses having built a level of prosperity that rivals almost anywhere else on the continent, its streets crowded with merchants, artisans, clergy, and the ordinary rhythms of a thriving medieval metropolis. Nothing about this wealth, this sophistication, or this careful civic organization offers any real protection against what is arriving. We are fortunate in a strange and somewhat unsettling way to have an eyewitness account of what happened in Florence that spring and summer, written by a young man who lived through it and later became one of the most celebrated writers of his age. He describes a city transformed almost beyond recognition within a matter of weeks. Physicians, for all their training, find themselves powerless against an illness that seems to defy every remedy available to them, and many begin refusing to visit the sick at all, unwilling to risk their own lives for patients they cannot save. This is not, it is worth saying clearly, a failure of compassion so much as a recognition, however painful, of simple arithmetic. A physician who dies attending one patient can help no one else afterward, and many made the agonizing calculation that survival itself, for whatever good they might still do, mattered more than a single doomed visit. What this same writer describes next is, I think, one of the most quietly devastating layers of this entire history, one that rarely receives the attention given to the death toll itself. He writes of parents abandoning children and children abandoning parents, not from cruelty but from a terror so complete that it overrode even the deepest bonds people had ever known. Husbands left wives, brothers left brothers. The ordinary fabric of family obligation, the assumption that those who loved you would stay beside you no matter what, simply came apart in the face of a disease that seemed to punish closeness itself, since standing near someone sick appeared correctly, as it turns out, to increase the danger of infection. Scholars still debate how widespread this particular breakdown truly was across the whole of Florence, since a single writer's account, however vivid, cannot speak for an entire city's experience, and some later chroniclers describe just as many instances of extraordinary devotion of family members who stayed and nursed the dying, at obvious cost to themselves. Both things were almost certainly true at once in different households under different pressures, which is itself a kind of honest complexity that flattened historical memory sometimes loses. There is a detail from Florence that surprises many people the first time they encounter it, something that speaks to just how completely the normal architecture of society buckled under the weight of what was happening. The city's usual burial customs, which involved individual graves, funeral processions, and the presence of priests to perform proper rites for each of the dead, simply could not keep pace with the scale of dying. Within weeks, the city begins digging enormous communal trenches at the edges of its cemeteries, laying the dead in successive layers, separated only by thin coverings of earth, much the way a ship's crew might stow cargo when space runs short. This was not disrespect. It was arithmetic, again the brutal mathematics of a burial system built for an ordinary death rate, suddenly asked to process losses many times beyond anything it had ever been designed to handle. Some estimates suggest that during the worst weeks of the outbreak, Florence may have lost several hundred residents in a single day, though the surviving records are incomplete enough that historians continue to debate the precise figures, and any single number offered with too much confidence should probably be treated with some caution. I find myself wondering when I read these accounts what it must have felt like to watch a city you knew intimately, whose streets and markets and church bells had structured the whole of your life, become unrecognizable within the span of a single season. How do you make sense of a world where the ordinary rules, the ones that told you how to bury your dead, how to care for your sick, how to trust the people around you, no longer seem to apply? The people of Florence had no framework for a catastrophe on this scale, because nothing in living memory and very little in recorded history before it had prepared any European city for this particular kind of collapse. There is one more detail from this same Florentine account worth lingering on, because it offers something unexpectedly human amid all this loss. The writer frames his description of the outbreak as the backdrop for a very different kind of story. One about 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men who flee the dying city together for a country estate, and while there to pass the difficult days and keep their spirits from breaking entirely under the weight of what they had witnessed, agree to take turns telling each other stories, one story from each of them, for 10 days running. It is a small, almost ordinary human impulse, this need to gather, to speak, to imagine other lives and other troubles, even while surrounded by unimaginable ones. And it is worth remembering, I think, alongside all the grimmer details of the outbreak, that people facing catastrophe on this scale did not stop being people. They still sought comfort in each other's company, still told stories to pass the evening, still found small pockets of ordinary life within a world that had otherwise come apart. The disease does not, of course, confine itself to Florence. It moves along the same trade routes and river valleys that had made the city prosperous in the first place, carried by merchants continuing their business even as their world came apart around them, by refugees fleeing infected towns for ones they believed, often wrongly, to be safer, and by the simple, relentless mathematics of rats and fleas, finding new grain stores, new households, new cities to colonize. Pisa, Genoa's ally and sometime rival, falls within weeks of Florence. Siena, a city whose own chroniclers left behind some of the most harrowing surviving descriptions of the period record's losses, so severe that an ambitious project to expand its great cathedral, already well underway and intended to make it the largest in the world, is abandoned entirely, its unfinished walls left standing as a strange monument to a future the city could no longer afford to build. The physical progression of the illness itself, as recorded across dozens of surviving accounts from this period, followed a pattern that struck contemporary observers as almost supernaturally consistent, however varied its final speed. Beyond the swellings already described, many victims developed dark blotches across the skin caused by bleeding beneath its surface, a symptom that some later folklore would come to associate somewhat imprecisely with the illness's eventual popular name. Fever chills, exhaustion, and a deep disorienting confusion often accompanied these physical signs, leaving many victims unable to fully understand or communicate what was happening to their own bodies in their final hours. Physicians of the era, working from the medical theories available to them, often interpreted these symptoms through the lens of imbalanced bodily humours, a framework inherited from ancient Greek medicine that had shaped European medical thinking for well over 1,000 years, and which offered little practical help against an illness whose true cause lay entirely outside anything that framework could address. By midsummer of 1348, the disease has moved beyond Italy, entirely following trade and pilgrimage routes into southern France, where the great papal city of Avignon, then serving as the seat of the Pope himself, rather than Rome, suffers losses so severe that mass graves become necessary there as well, on a scale that some contemporary accounts describe as unprecedented in the memory of anyone living. The Pope of the time, faced with a crisis affecting the whole of Christendom, consults with the physicians attached to his own court, and among the measures they eventually recommend is something that sounds almost startlingly modern to us. Now, the deliberate separation of the sick from the healthy, and caution around gatherings of large crowds advice that, however imperfectly it could actually be followed in a crowded medieval city, reflects a genuine attempt to reason carefully about how this disease seemed to move from person to person. From Avignon, the routes fan outward towards Spain, toward the Rhine Valley, toward the English Channel, that Thomas's small village will feel the effects of before another year has passed. What becomes clear watching this spread unfold across so many different regions and cultures is that almost nothing about a place's wealth, sophistication, or piety offered any meaningful protection. Prosperous trading cities fell as readily as small rural villages. Devout religious communities whose members prayed and fasted with real sincerity suffered losses just as devastating as those recorded in towns with reputations for looser morals, a pattern that troubled contemporary observers deeply, since many of them had assumed quite reasonably, given their worldview, that a catastrophe of this scale must reflect some form of divine judgment aimed at particular sinners, rather than an indiscriminate biological event moving through fleas, rats, and human breath without any regard whatsoever for virtue or vice. This is one of the quieter, stranger truths sitting at the heart of this entire history, one worth pausing on before we move further into the story. The disease made no distinction between the pious and the impious, the wealthy and the poor, the wise and the foolish, though it did, in practical terms, sometimes spread more easily among people living in crowded conditions, and the wealthy occasionally had somewhat more capacity to flee to isolated country estates when the earliest signs of an outbreak appeared nearby, not unlike the 10 young Florentines whose story we paused with earlier. Even that advantage, though, proved limited and unreliable, since the disease travelled with a speed and an invisibility that made true escape nearly impossible for most people regardless of their means. Kings and cardinals died beside beggars and field labourers, and the surviving records of the period, however, incomplete, make it clear that this fact troubled the 14th century's understanding of the world almost as deeply as the death toll itself. If suffering on this scale was meant to signal divine judgment, as so many contemporary observers initially assumed, what judgment could possibly explain the death of a devout monk in the same week as a notorious criminal in the same town from the exact same illness? By the closing months of 1348, this disease that had begun its documented journey in the grasslands of Central Asia crossed the Mediterranean aboard doomed trading vessels and established its first European foothold in a Sicilian harbour town, has already reshaped the map of human suffering across an enormous stretch of the continent, and it is only beginning to reach the regions where its most devastating chapters have yet to unfold. There comes a point in the story of almost every place this disease touched when death simply outpaces the ability of the living to respond to it, and it is worth slowing down here to understand what that actually meant in practice rather than treating it as a single dramatic turning point. By the time the disease crosses the English Channel, likely arriving through the port town of Weymouth on the southern coast in the early summer of 1348, it has already had nearly a full year to refine, in a sense, its own devastating efficiency, moving through cities that had inadvertently taught it every weakness of medieval urban and rural life. England receives it not as a single dramatic invasion, but as a slow creeping arrival, first along the coasts, then inland along the same roads and river valleys that carried wool grain and travellers between towns. Thomas in his small village is simply one of thousands of individual moments like this one, each household discovering in its own private mourning that the rumours from the coast had finally arrived at their own door. What made this particular stretch of the outbreak so overwhelming was not only the number of deaths staggering, as that number was, but the speed with which those deaths accumulated relative to what any community's existing structures could absorb. A typical medieval parish, whether in rural England or urban Italy, had systems built for an ordinary rate of death priests who could administer last rites to a handful of dying parishioners each month, grave diggers who could prepare individual burial plots at a manageable pace, notaries who could record wills and property transfers as they occurred in the natural, unhurried rhythm of daily life. None of these systems were designed for a world where a third of a community's population might die within a matter of weeks. The infrastructure of ordinary death, built patiently over generations, simply could not scale to meet a catastrophe of this magnitude, and its failure piece by piece is itself one of the most revealing parts of this entire history. Consider the role of the parish priest, a figure whose duties placed him quite literally in the most dangerous possible position during an outbreak like this one. Priests were expected to visit the dying, hear confessions, and administer last rites, tasks that required close physical contact with people in the advanced stages of an extremely contagious illness. The mortality rate among clergy during this period appears to have been strikingly high, in many regions significantly higher than among the general population, precisely because their religious duties placed them repeatedly in direct contact with the sick and dying at the exact moments when the disease was most transmissible. Some historians estimate that as many as half of England's parish clergy may have died during the worst years of the outbreak, though the surviving records vary enough by the region that any single figure should be treated as an informed estimate rather than a precise count. This had consequences that rippled forward for decades afterwards, since the church found itself replacing enormous numbers of experienced clergy with younger, less thoroughly trained successors simply because there was no other way to keep parish life functioning at all. This same pressure reshaped religious practice in smaller, quieter ways that rarely make it into popular accounts of the period. In many parishes, so many priests died in such rapid succession that bishops found themselves granting special permissions, allowing lay people, ordinary men and women with no formal religious training, to hear confessions and offer what comfort they could to the dying out of simple necessity rather than any change in doctrine. Church records from several English dioceses during this period describe bishops writing anxious letters acknowledging that proper procedure could no longer be maintained, that the dying deserved some form of spiritual comfort, even if the person offering it lacked the formal authorities to do so under ordinary circumstances. It is a small bureaucratic detail buried in surviving diocesan registers, but it captures something significant about how completely this catastrophe forced even the most rigid institutions of medieval society to bend. I think this detail matters more than it might first appear, because it illustrates something true about catastrophes of this scale that is easy to overlook when we focus only on the raw numbers of the dead. The people whose social role required them to care for the dying were disproportionately likely to become victims themselves, which meant that the very institutions a frightened population most needed in order to make sense of what was happening and to feel that someone somewhere still understood how to manage death properly were being hollowed out from within at the precise moment they were needed most. The physical evidence of just how overwhelming this became has remarkably survived into the present day, and it offers a kind of confirmation that written chronicles alone cannot provide. In London, archaeologists excavating a site associated with this period uncovered a series of mass burial trenches carefully organised despite the emergency, containing hundreds of individuals laid in orderly rows, several bodies deep. What strikes researchers who have studied this site is the evidence of genuine care taken even amid catastrophe. Bodies, arranged with some attention to dignity, coffins used where materials allowed a burial ground that reflects a community trying against overwhelming odds to preserve some measure of proper treatment for its dead, even as the ordinary mechanisms for doing so had completely broken down. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how representative this particular site is of burial practices across England as a whole, since different regions and different social classes within those regions likely handled the crisis in ways that varied considerably depending on available resources and local custom. There is a detail from these excavations that surprises many people, one rarely discussed outside of specialized archaeological literature. Analysis of the skeletal remains recovered from these mass graves shows evidence that many of the individuals buried there were in fact in reasonably good health before their infection, challenging an older assumption that this disease primarily killed people who were already weakened by malnutrition or chronic illness. Scholars continue to debate exactly how significant this finding is for our broader understanding of the outbreak's mortality patterns, but it lends support to accounts from the period describing the disease as capable of killing robust, previously healthy adults with the same terrible efficiency it showed toward the very young, the very old, and the already frail. This was not, in other words, simply a catastrophe that swept away the already vulnerable. It reached indiscriminately into households of every kind of physical constitution. Researchers examining these same remains have also been able to estimate with reasonable confidence the age and general health profile of the people interred there, and the picture that emerges is a quietly sobering one. Skeletons show evidence of individuals across every stage of adult life, labourers whose bones bear the marks of hard physical work and children whose small frames sit among the rows of adults, a reminder that this disease respected no boundary of age, any more than it respected boundaries of wealth or piety. Isotope analysis of the teeth recovered from some of these burials has even allowed researchers to make educated guesses about where certain individuals grew up based on the particular chemical signatures left behind by the water and food of different regions, suggesting that London's dead during this period included people who had migrated to the city from considerable distances, drawn by opportunity into a city that would, within a matter of months, become the site of their deaths instead. What did daily life actually look like for the people still alive and still functioning during these months when death seemed to be everywhere at once? Markets remarkably did not entirely stop, though they shrank considerably as merchants died, fled, or simply stayed home out of fear. Fields went unharvested in many regions, not from any lack of will among surviving farmers, but because there were quite literally not enough living hands remaining to bring in a harvest that had been planted for a much larger population. Stock wandered untended in some areas since the shepherds and farmhands who would ordinarily have cared for them were themselves dead or too ill to work. Wills were made hastily, sometimes scrawled by dying hands or dictated to whichever neighbour happened to still be alive and willing to serve as witness, since the formal notaries who would ordinarily have handled such matters were often dead themselves, or overwhelmed many times beyond their capacity. And yet even in the midst of all this, life did not entirely stop. Babies were still born, marriages still occurred, sometimes hastily, between survivors who had lost spouses and now needed practical partnerships to manage what remained of their households and lands. Some historians have noted with a kind of quiet astonishment that birth rates in some regions appear to have risen somewhat in the years immediately following the worst of the outbreak. Evidence, perhaps, of a very human instinct toward rebuilding even amid overwhelming loss, though this pattern likely reflects several converging factors, including younger average ages of marriage among survivors who suddenly found themselves inheriting property and land that would previously have taken them decades longer to acquire. Trade too found strange and sometimes surprising ways to continue. Merchants who survived often discovered that the sudden scarcity of skilled labour and goods created unexpected opportunities, even as it created enormous hardship elsewhere. A surviving weaver, a surviving carpenter, a surviving blacksmith suddenly found their skills in far greater demand relative to the shrunken supply of people able to perform them. And wages for surviving labourers across many parts of Europe began almost immediately to rise in ways that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. This shift, subtle as it may have seemed to the people living through it in the immediate aftermath, was quietly planting the seeds of economic and social changes that would unfold across the following decades, changes we will spend more time with later in this story, once the full shape of what this catastrophe rearranged becomes clearer. How does a society even begin to grasp a loss on this scale while it is still happening? Contemporary chroniclers across dozens of independent accounts from England, France and Italy describe something close to a shared sense of disorientation, an inability to fully process events even as they were living through them. Many wrote that they expected the world itself might be ending, an entirely reasonable conclusion for anyone attempting to make sense of a catastrophe this total, using only the intellectual and religious frameworks their era had provided them. One English chronicler, writing from a monastery that had lost the great majority of its own monks' records, simply that he began the entry expecting to continue it later, and then in a haunting detail that historians have noted with real sympathy appears to have died himself shortly after writing those words. The remainder of his chronicles page left blank a stillness more eloquent than anything he might have written to fill it. Few could have imagined, watching their communities empty around them, that human civilization would not only survive this catastrophe, but would eventually be reshaped by it in ways that touched nearly every aspect of how ordinary people lived, worked, and understood their place in the world. The worst of the immediate dying in most regions would not last forever, though it would take considerably longer than anyone living through it could have hoped. And as the disease's first devastating wave began region by region to finally subside, it left behind a world so fundamentally altered that even the physicians, priests, and scholars who had tried hardest to understand what had happened to them were only beginning to grasp the shape of the questions they would spend the rest of their lives and the rest of the century trying to answer. There is a particular kind of history that rarely makes it into the broader accounts of this outbreak, not because it was hidden, but because it is harder to write about with the careful accuracy. Historians demand the simple, intimate experience of what it actually felt like to be sick moment by moment inside a body that did not yet have a name for what was happening to it. We have touched already on the outward signs, the swellings, the fever, the marks that appeared on the skin. What I want to sit with now is something quieter and in its own way more human. How a person's own experience of those hours might have unfolded, and how the people around them tried with whatever knowledge their world provided to offer comfort. Medieval medicine of the 14th century organized its understanding of the human body around a framework inherited from ancient physicians. The idea that health depended on a careful balance among 4 bodily substances, often translated as blood, phlegm, and 2 forms of bile, and that illness resulted whenever this balance tipped too far in one direction. It was within its own internal logic, a coherent and thoughtful system, one that had guided medical practice across Europe for well over 1,000 years, and had proven at least somewhat useful for understanding a great many ordinary ailments. Against this particular disease, however, the framework offered almost nothing of real value, though. Physicians working diligently within the only system they did not yet know that. A person falling ill would typically be visited, if a physician was available at all by this point in the outbreak, by someone who examined their pulse, inspected the colour and consistency of their urine, and asked about recent diet, sleep, and any unusual exposures to bad air or foul smells, since the dominant medical theory of the time held that this disease, like many others, was likely caused or worsened by corrupted air, sometimes called miasma, thought to rise from swamps, unburied bodies, or simply crowded and poorly ventilated living spaces. Given this belief, physicians frequently recommended remedies aimed at correcting the surrounding air itself. Patients and their families were advised to burn aromatic woods and herbs in the sick room, to carry small bundles of sweet-smelling flowers or herbs close to the nose when moving through the streets, and to avoid opening windows toward directions believed to carry particularly corrupted air. None of this, we now understand, had any real effect on a disease transmitted primarily through fleas, and in its rarer form through the air exhaled by an already infected person. But it is worth remembering that these were not foolish or careless responses. They were reasonable actions taken by people working entirely within the best scientific understanding available to them at the time. Medical treatises written during and shortly after this period, which survive in university and monastery libraries across Europe, reveal physicians grappling seriously and thoughtfully with a problem their entire intellectual tradition had left them unprepared for. One widely circulated treatise compiled by physicians attached to the medical faculty of Paris at the request of the French king attempted to explain the outbreak through an unusual astrological theory, proposing that a specific alignment of planets some years earlier had corrupted the air across a wide portion of the known world, a conclusion that strikes modern readers as strange, yet which represented within the intellectual framework of the time a serious and carefully reasoned attempt to apply the best available science to an unprecedented problem. These physicians were not charlatans. They were in many cases among the most educated people of their era, doing genuinely rigorous work within a system of knowledge that had simply not yet developed the tools needed to identify bacteria, let alone the fleas and rodents that carried them. Bloodletting, a remedy central to humoral medicine more broadly, was also commonly recommended based on the theory that removing a measured quantity of blood might help restore the body's internal balance. Physicians who practiced this approach did so with genuine care and precision within their own framework, often consulting detailed charts indicating which veins to open, depending on the location of a patient's symptoms and the phase of the moon, itself believed to influence the movement of bodily fluids. We know now, of course, that this practice offered no benefit against the underlying infection and likely weakened patients who were already fighting for their lives, though it would take medicine several more centuries to fully abandon humoral theory and the practices built upon it. For pain, and there was a great deal of pain, physicians and family caregivers alike turned to whatever they had available. Preparations containing opium extracted from poppies grown across parts of the Mediterranean and imported along the same trade networks that had in a bitter irony likely helped carry the disease itself. Westward in earlier centuries were used to ease suffering in patients whose condition had progressed beyond a hope of recovery. Herbal preparations, some genuinely soothing, others almost certainly ineffective beyond whatever comfort came from the ritual of care itself, were applied to the swellings that mark the disease's most visible symptom, sometimes in the form of warm poultices, intended to draw out what physicians believe to be corrupted matter trapped beneath the skin. Some physicians, working from a related theory that suggested corrupted matter needed a path to leave the body, recommended carefully lancing the swellings once they had progressed to a certain point, a practice that occasionally and likely by accident rather than genuine medical understanding provided some real relief by releasing pressure and infected material that had accumulated beneath the skin. It is one of the stranger footnotes of this history that a practice performed for entirely the wrong theoretical reasons may in certain cases have offered patients a small measure of genuine physical benefit, a reminder that medieval medicine, however limited its underlying theory, was not without moments of accidental hard-won practical wisdom. I want to pause here on something that I think matters enormously, something easy to lose sight of when we focus only on the medical failures of the period. The people caring for the sick, whether trained physicians or simply frightened family members doing their best with no training at all, were not passive witnesses to death. They were actively, desperately trying to help using every tool their world had given them, sitting through long nights beside people they loved, offering water, cool cloths, quiet words, whatever. Comfort a human presence could still provide even when medicine itself had nothing more to offer. This is, I think, one of the truest and most enduring parts of this entire history, that even in the face of an illness that defied every remedy available, people did not stop trying to care for each other. That instinct, as old and as human as anything in this story, persisted even when hope for recovery had largely disappeared. Consider for a moment what this actually required of the people providing that care. Nursing someone through this illness meant remaining in close physical proximity to a person whose condition made clear, often within hours, that the disease was highly contagious, since neighbouring households where one member fell ill so frequently saw others in the same home fall ill soon after. Caregivers understood this risk, at least in a general sense, even without any precise understanding of how the illness actually spread from person to person, and yet surviving wills, letters, and chronicle entries from across the affected regions describe spouses, parents, and children who chose to remain, regardless, a choice that historians studying the period have come to see as one of the most quietly remarkable aspects of the entire outbreak. Fear did not disappear. It coexisted in household after household with a form of love and obligation strong enough to override it. There is a detail from this period that surprises many people the first time they encounter it, one that offers a small strange thread of scientific insight buried within the tragedy. Chroniclers and physicians across several regions independently noted something they could not fully explain. A small number of people who had survived infection during an earlier wave of the outbreak seemed, when exposed to the disease again later, to become sick far less often, or to recover with a speed that puzzled everyone around them. Some communities began quite informally and without any theoretical understanding of what was happening, to rely on these survivors specifically to nurse the newly sick reasoning correctly, even without the language of immunity that would not exist for centuries, that these particular people seemed somehow protected in a way others were not. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread this practice became and how consistently communities recognized and acted on this pattern, since our evidence comes from scattered chronicle entries rather than any systematic record, but the underlying biological reality they were observing without knowing it was real. Surviving this particular infection did in many cases confer a meaningful degree of future protection, a fact that 14th century observers understood only as a strange and fortunate pattern long before modern immunology could explain precisely why. What did it feel like in those final hours for the person actually experiencing this illness? We can only approach an answer to that question carefully and with real humility about the limits of what surviving records can tell us. Chroniclers describe high fever disorientation and in many cases a kind of profound exhaustion that left victims unable to fully engage with the world around them in their final day or two of life. Family members frequently describe loved ones drifting in and out of clear awareness, sometimes recognizing those beside them, sometimes not, a pattern consistent with what we now understand about how severe systemic infection affects the brain in its advanced stages. For some, death came with what witnesses described as a kind of unexpected peace and easing after the worst of the fever had passed. For others, the final hours were marked by visible distress that those keeping vigil beside them clearly found difficult to witness and difficult later to write about in any detail. A handful of surviving personal letters from this period preserved in family and municipal archives across Italy and France offer something rarer, still a genuinely intimate glimpse of how individual people processed what they were living through. One merchant writing to a business associate in another city pauses in the middle of routine trade correspondence to mention almost in passing that he has just returned from burying his wife and two of his children within the same week, before continuing on to discuss an unrelated matter of shipping and payment, a jarring shift that modern readers often find difficult to process, but which likely reflects less indifference than sheer necessity. The simple fact that life and the obligations it carried did not pause to allow for extended grief, however much that grief was genuinely felt. It is worth remembering gently that not everyone who fell ill died. Survival rates varied considerably depending on the form of the disease. A person contracted, with some historians estimating that a meaningful minority of those infected with the more common form, the one producing the characteristic swellings, did eventually recover their bodies, somehow managing to overcome an infection that killed so many others around them. We do not fully understand even now why some individuals' immune systems proved more capable of fighting off this particular bacterium than others, though modern genetic research has begun identifying certain inherited traits that may have offered some populations a degree of natural resistance. A fascinating thread of scientific inquiry that continues even today to reveal new layers of understanding about this centuries-old catastrophe. For those who did recover, the experience left lasting physical marks, in many cases scarring where the swellings had been lanced or had eventually burst on their own, a visible reminder carried for the rest of their lives of what they had survived. It also left something else, something harder to measure, but clearly present in the surviving accounts, a kind of quiet authority among survivors. A recognition within their communities that these were people who had looked directly at what seemed to nearly everyone else like certain death and had somehow returned from it. Family life itself, in households where recovery did occur, often bore the marks of the experience for years afterward. Surviving accounts from several regions describe households reorganized around unexpected combinations of grief and relief, A widow raising children alongside nieces or nephews whose own parents had not survived, an elderly relative suddenly caring for grandchildren whose entire immediate family had been lost within the same terrible weeks. The ordinary shape of the medieval household, built around expectations of generational continuity and inherited roles, was quietly and permanently reshaped in thousands of individual unrecorded ways across every region. This disease touched long before anyone began writing the larger economic and social histories that would eventually try to make sense of what had happened at scale. As the worst of this first devastating wave finally began to ease in, region after region, the people who remained exhausted, grieving, and profoundly changed by what they had witnessed, found themselves facing an entirely new set of questions about cause, about meaning, and about what, if anything, could be done to explain a catastrophe that had upended every assumption their world had once held about health, illness, and the order of things. Grief this total does not remain a private matter for very long. It moves outward inevitably into the institutions people relied upon to explain the world. And it is worth spending some time now with how those institutions, religious and civic alike, responded to a catastrophe that none of them had any real framework for understanding. The medieval church stood in ordinary times at the very centre of how most Europeans made sense of suffering. Illness, death, and misfortune were generally understood within a framework of divine providence, sometimes as tests of faith, sometimes as consequences of sin, sometimes simply as mysteries beyond human comprehension that faith alone could help a person endure. This framework had served European communities reasonably well across centuries of ordinary hardship, wars, famines, and more localized outbreaks of disease. Against a catastrophe of this scale, though many people found themselves reaching for an explanation more urgent and more active than quiet endurance, something that felt like it might actually do something to address what was happening, ordinary religious practice adapted in countless smaller ways as well, alongside the more dramatic response of the flagellant processions. Devotion to particular saints believed to offer protection against plague and pestilence intensified considerably during these years, with communities across Europe commissioning new shrines, chapels, and paintings dedicated to figures whose stories seemed to speak directly to their present suffering. A martyr from the early centuries of the Church, traditionally associated with surviving repeated attempts on his life through arrows, became an especially popular figure of devotion. His survival of near-fatal wounds, interpreted by frightened communities as a hopeful symbol that the body might, with divine favour, withstand what seemed otherwise certain to kill it. Another figure, a pilgrim saint associated more directly with plague survival itself, according to traditions that developed and spread particularly during this exact period, became the subject of new veneration across parts of France and Italy. His story offering communities a model of someone who had reportedly contracted this very illness, survived it through faith and endurance, and continued caring for others afterward. Whether every detail of these devotional traditions reflects historical accuracy, in the strictest sense, is difficult to establish this many centuries later, but their sudden and widespread popularity during precisely this period tells us something genuine and important about what frightened communities needed to believe was possible. This is the context in which a movement known to history as the Flagellants emerges, spreading with real intensity across parts of Germany, the Low Countries, and eventually into other regions of continental Europe during the worst years of the outbreak. Groups of lay people, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, organized themselves into processions that moved from town to town, engaging in public acts of penance intended to atone for what they believed were the collective sins bringing God's judgment upon the world. These processions followed a fairly consistent structure across the various accounts that survive participants marching together, often for exactly 33 days one day for each year of Christ's earthly life, according to tradition, performing acts of physical penance in public squares, before moving on to the next town along their route. Contemporary chroniclers describe these processions as genuinely striking events for the towns they passed through, drawing enormous crowds of onlookers who gathered, not out of idle curiosity, but out of the same desperate hope that animated the participants themselves. A hope that some visible communal act of devotion might finally persuade heaven to lift the suffering that ordinary prayer alone had failed to end. Local chronicles from several German towns describe entire communities pausing their ordinary business to watch these processions arrive. Church bells ringing to mark their entry, and in some cases watching townspeople joining the march themselves, swelling the numbers of a group that had in some instances begun as a modest band of a few dozen penitents in one town and grown into a procession of many hundreds by the time it reached the next. It is worth pausing here to say clearly that this was not, in its origins, a fringe or marginal phenomenon. The flagellant movement drew participants from across the social spectrum and in its early stages received a measure of sympathy and in some places even open support from local clergy and civic authorities who saw in it a sincere if severe expression of the same desperate desire for meaning and control that gripped nearly everyone living through this catastrophe. People wanted to believe that suffering on this scale must be responding to something, that there was some action, however difficult, that might address the underlying cause and bring the dying to an end. The movement's relationship with official church authority, however, grew increasingly strained as it spread and as its rhetoric in some branches began drifting toward claims of spiritual authority that rivaled or bypassed the institutional church entirely. Some flagellant leaders began claiming the ability to forgive sins directly, a power the church reserved exclusively for its own ordained clergy, and by the end of the decade, the papacy in Avignon had issued formal condemnation of the movement, instructing local bishops to suppress it wherever it appeared. Scholars still debate how effective this suppression actually was in practice, since the movement had already spread widely enough and tapped into a deep enough well of genuine public anguish that formal condemnation from distant religious authority did not immediately end its presence in many affected regions. What makes this episode particularly worth understanding, I think, is what it reveals about the relationship between institutional religious authority and the genuine unmediated grief of ordinary people during a catastrophe this overwhelming. The Church's official theology offered comfort through patience, prayer, and acceptance of divine will, a framework built for hardship measured in the ordinary rhythms of a human life. The flagellants, whatever theological errors their movement eventually accumulated, were responding to something the official framework had not adequately addressed, a need not simply to endure suffering, but to actively do something visible and immediate in the face of it. That tension between patient faith and desperate action surfaces again and again throughout this history, in forms both admirable and, as we are about to see, deeply troubling. There is a darker thread running alongside this history that deserves honest and careful acknowledgement, because leaving it unspoken would misrepresent what actually happened during these years. As communities searched desperately for explanation, and in some tragic cases for someone to blame, Jewish communities across parts of continental Europe became targets of horrific violence, driven by accusations entirely baseless, that they had deliberately poisoned wells and water sources in order to spread the disease. These accusations spread through fear and rumour rather than any genuine evidence, and they led in city after city across the German-speaking regions and beyond to organised violence against Jewish communities that had in reality no more connection to the outbreak's origins than any other population suffering through the same catastrophe. Some civic and religious authorities recognized these accusations for what they were and attempted to intervene. The Pope in Avignon issued formal statements condemning the violence and specifically noting that Jewish communities were dying from this disease in numbers comparable to their Christian neighbours. a fact that should have made the poisoning accusations obviously absurd to anyone considering them with any care, since a population deliberately spreading a disease would hardly be dying from it at the same devastating rate. This official condemnation, though genuinely issued, and genuinely meant proved largely powerless against the momentum of fear and violence that had already taken hold in many communities. A sobering reminder that even clear moral and factual authority does not always prove strong enough to overcome panic once it has fully seized a frightened population. Entire Jewish communities in numerous cities were destroyed during this period. Their populations killed or driven into permanent exile, a tragedy that stands as one of the genuinely darkest chapters within this already devastating history, and one that responsible historical accounts owe it to the people who suffered through it to remember, honestly rather than pass over in silence. I want to be careful here in the way this channel tries always to be careful to hold two things true at once. This violence was real and it caused immense and permanent suffering to communities who had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. And at the same time, it does not represent the whole of how 14th century Europe responded to this catastrophe. Alongside the persecution, there were also communities that sheltered Jewish neighbours from mob violence authorities who genuinely tried, even if imperfectly, to intervene, and countless individual acts of restraint and decency amid widespread panic that rarely make it into the historical record precisely because restraint and decency, unlike violence, tend to leave less dramatic evidence behind for later generations to find. Some rulers took more concrete action than words alone. Several regional authorities, including certain German dukes and Italian city officials, extended formal legal protection to Jewish communities within their territories during this period, offering refuge to families fleeing violence elsewhere, even as neighbouring territories failed entirely to prevent the same violence within their own borders. This patchwork of protection and persecution, varying enormously from one town to the next, reflects something historians and studying the period have come to recognise as a broader pattern. Catastrophe does not produce a single uniform human response, but rather reveals often starkly the particular character, courage and moral failures already present within each individual community long before the crisis arrived to test them. What might explain in human terms why fear this total so often curdled into blame rather than solidarity? Historians studying the psychology of catastrophe across many different periods and cultures have noted a recurring pattern, one visible in this outbreak and in numerous others throughout history. Uncertainty and helplessness, sustained long enough and intensely enough, often generate a desperate need for some explanation that restores a feeling of agency, even a false one, over events that otherwise feel completely beyond human control or comprehension. Blaming a specific identifiable group offered something that accepting a random indifferent biological catastrophe simply could not. The illusion that the suffering had a cause that could in theory be addressed and stopped. This does not excuse what happened. It helps explain in a way that I think matters for understanding human behaviour more broadly how ordinary fear, left unchecked and unchallenged by the institutions meant to guide it, could produce such devastating consequences. Physicians, meanwhile, continued their own more measured, if ultimately equally unsuccessful, search for understanding. Medical faculties at several European universities produced increasingly detailed treatises attempting to catalogue symptoms, propose treatments, and refine the prevailing theories about corrupted air and bodily imbalance. Some of this work, though built on a fundamentally incorrect understanding of the disease's true cause, nonetheless represented genuine advances in careful clinical observation, the kind of systematic documentation of symptoms and outcomes that would centuries later form part of the foundation for more scientifically grounded medical practice. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete regarding exactly how much these treatises influenced actual treatment on the ground, since the gap between what universities produced and what a rural parish priest or village healer actually had access to during the crisis itself was often considerable. One physician's personal experience preserved in unusual detail thanks to his own careful writing offers a rare window into what this work actually demanded of the people brave enough to keep practicing it. Serving as physician to the Pope himself in Avignon, he continued treating patients throughout the worst months of the outbreak, documenting symptoms and outcomes with a rigor unusual for his era, even as he watched colleague after colleague either flee the city or die attempting to do the work. He continued. He eventually contracted the disease himself, developing the characteristic swellings that had killed so many of his own patients, and survived an outcome he attributed with admirable scientific honesty less to any particular remedy than to what he candidly described as simple good fortune. His surviving writings remain even now among the most valuable first-hand medical accounts of the entire outbreak, precisely because he approached even his own near-fatal illness with the same careful observational eye he brought to every other patient he treated. By the closing years of the 1340s, as the disease's first devastating wave finally began to recede across most of Europe, the continent's religious, civic, and medical institutions had all been tested in ways none of them had ever previously experienced, and each had responded with a complicated mixture of genuine wisdom, sincere effort, tragic failure, and in some cases real cruelty. It is worth remembering as we carry these events forward with us that the people living through this were not so different from people facing catastrophe in any era, reaching for whatever combination of faith, science, community, and unfortunately sometimes blame that their particular moment in history had equipped them with. What remained as the immediate crisis eased was the far larger and more difficult work of understanding what had actually happened. A task that would occupy scholars, physicians, and historians for centuries to come, and one that modern science working with tools 14th century Europe could never have imagined would eventually be able to approach with a clarity that no chronicler living through those terrible years could possibly have achieved. For nearly 6 centuries, everything we understood about this catastrophe came from what people at the time chose or were able to write down. That changed considerably within living memory once scientists developed the tools to ask the dead themselves what actually happened, and what those tools revealed has settled debates that historians had argued over for generations. The scientific breakthrough at the center of this story involves a substance far smaller and far more durable than anything a 14th century chronicler could have imagined: fragments of genetic material preserved for centuries within the teeth of people who died during this outbreak. The dense material inside a tooth, protected by layers of enamel and bone, turns out to be remarkably good at preserving traces of whatever infection was circulating in a person's bloodstream at the time of their death, sometimes for hundreds or even thousands of years, sealed away from the kind of environmental decay that destroys genetic material in most other parts of a skeleton. The actual process by which researchers extract this evidence is in its own way a small marvel of patient, careful science. A tooth recovered from a centuries-old burial is carefully cleaned to remove any modern genetic contamination that might have accumulated during the excavation, then drilled with extreme precision to access the dense inner material where blood vessels once ran during the person's life. From this small sample, researchers extract whatever fragments of genetic material have survived the centuries, fragments that are typically degraded, broken into short damaged pieces, rather than the long intact strands a laboratory might expect from living tissue. Reconstructing a usable genetic sequence from this kind of damaged ancient material requires enormously sophisticated computational techniques, essentially piecing together a genetic puzzle from thousands of tiny overlapping fragments. A technical achievement that would have been simply impossible only a few decades ago, and remains genuinely remarkable even by today's scientific standards. Researchers working with remains recovered from mass burial sites across Europe, including the London site we spent time with, earlier in this story began starting in the early years of this century, applying increasingly sophisticated genetic sequencing techniques to these preserved dental samples. What they were looking for was direct genetic confirmation of exactly which pathogen had caused this outbreak, a question that remarkably had remained genuinely open to scientific debate for a surprisingly long time. Some researchers in the decades before this genetic evidence became available had proposed that the historical descriptions of symptoms and transmission patterns did not perfectly match what modern medicine understood about the specific bacterium most commonly associated with the disease, leading a small number of scientists to seriously entertain the possibility that this particular outbreak might have been caused by an entirely different pathogen, something closer to a viral hemorrhagic fever, or possibly some combination of several diseases spreading simultaneously. This is one of the details that genuinely surprises people when they first learn it. For a period of time extending into the early 2000s, the specific biological cause of history's most devastating pandemic remained a subject of real unresolved scientific controversy, argued over in academic journals by researchers working from historical descriptions and modern epidemiological modelling rather than from direct physical evidence. The debate was resolved decisively and with the level of certainty that satisfied even the most skeptical researchers by the genetic evidence itself. Multiple independent research teams working with dental samples recovered from mass graves in London, France, and other affected regions successfully extracted and sequenced genetic material that matched with overwhelming statistical confidence the bacterium responsible for the disease we now understand as the primary cause of this outbreak. This finding did more than simply confirm what many historians had long suspected. It allowed researchers to reconstruct in remarkable detail something like a family tree for this particular pathogen tracing, how different genetic variants of the bacterium related to one another across time and geography, essentially mapping the evolutionary history of an organism responsible for one of the largest mass mortality events in recorded human history. This same genetic family tree has helped resolve another question that historians and studying the outbreak's spread had long argued over, one we touched on earlier, when discussing how the disease first crossed into Italy. By comparing genetic samples recovered from different regions of Europe, researchers have found evidence suggesting the outbreak likely did enter the continent through several distinct points of contact rather than spreading outward from a single origin in a neat linear fashion, a finding that lends genuine scientific support to what historians had already begun to suspect from the somewhat scattered and simultaneous pattern of early outbreaks recorded in port cities across the Mediterranean. What this genetic family tree reveals is, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable scientific stories connected to this entire history. By comparing the genetic sequence recovered from 14th century victims to sequences taken from modern outbreaks of the same disease which still occurs on a far smaller and more manageable scale in certain regions of the world today, researchers have been able to estimate roughly when this particular bacterial lineage first diverged from its ancestors and began the specific evolutionary path that led to the 14th century catastrophe. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete regarding the precise timing and location of this divergence, since genetic dating techniques of this kind carry inherent margins of uncertainty. But the general picture that emerges aligns closely with the historical evidence pointing towards Central Asia as the outbreak's ultimate point of origin, offering a rare and genuinely satisfying convergence between two entirely different kinds of evidence. One written by human hands, the other written into the genetic code of the pathogen itself. There is a discovery within this broader field of research that surprises even many people who consider themselves reasonably familiar with this history. Genetic analysis of much older human remains from archaeological sites dating back several thousand years has revealed that ancestral forms of this same bacterium were already present in human populations across parts of Europe and Asia long before the 14th century outbreak, circulating in much smaller and less devastating forms for millennia before the specific genetic changes that produced the catastrophic pandemic strain ever developed. This finding has opened an entirely new area of scientific inquiry into how and why certain evolutionary changes within this bacterium's genetic code transformed it at some point in its long history from a comparatively limited pathogen into one capable of producing mortality on the scale witnessed during the 14th century. Scholars and researchers continue to debate exactly which genetic changes proved most decisive in this transformation, since the bacterium's evolutionary history involves multiple distinct branches and variations whose relative significance is still being carefully worked out. What makes this deep evolutionary history so striking is the sheer span of time involved. Some of the oldest confirmed genetic traces of this bacterial lineage recovered from human remains associated with populations who lived thousands of years before the 14th century outbreak come from burial sites scattered across a vast stretch of territory extending from Central Europe through the Eurasian steppe. This tells us that the relationship between this particular pathogen and human populations was not as it might first appear from the 14th century catastrophe alone, a sudden and unprecedented event, but rather the latest and by far the most devastating chapter in a much longer and quieter story of a bacterium and its human hosts coexisting, evolving, and occasionally clashing across many thousands of years of shared history. Most of these earlier encounters, based on what the genetic evidence can tell us so far, appear to have caused comparatively limited outbreaks, nothing approaching the scale of what unfolded in the 14th century, though the evidence here remains genuinely incomplete since we are limited to whatever ancient remains happen to have survived in conditions suitable for genetic preservation. A small and almost certainly unrepresentative sample of everyone who actually lived and died across these many centuries. I find something genuinely moving in this particular piece of the story, something that goes beyond simple scientific curiosity. The people whose remains were recovered from that London burial ground and from similar sites across Europe have become, in a very real sense, witnesses testifying on behalf of everyone whose individual death left no written record at all. Thomas the young labourer, whose story opened this account, left behind no letter, no will, no chronicle entry bearing his name, but people very much like him buried in graves not so different from the one his own village likely dug for him, have had their bones examined with a level of scientific care and precision that would have seemed like pure magic to anyone living through the 14th century, and through that examination they have helped answer questions that troubled scholars for 600 years. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this scientific vindication came in the end from the very people the historical record so often overlooks. The written chronicles of this outbreak were composed almost entirely by educated clergy, university physicians and court officials' voices that, however valuable, represent only a narrow slice of the millions who actually lived and died during this catastrophe. The skeletal evidence recovered from mass graves carries no such bias. It includes labourers and merchants, the very young and the very old women, whose names appear in no surviving document alongside men whose families could never have afforded a proper chronicle entry. In a quiet, almost poetic sense, modern genetic science has finally given a kind of voice, however, limited to exactly the ordinary people this entire story has tried to keep close to its centre from the very beginning. This genetic work has also allowed researchers to address a question that historians studying mortality figures had struggled with for generations. How quickly and how thoroughly did this bacterium actually spread once it arrived in a new community? By analysing genetic variation among samples recovered from geographically distant burial sites, Researchers have been able to trace the pathogen's movement across Europe with a level of precision that written chronicles, however detailed, could never have provided on their own. This evidence broadly confirms the picture we have already traced through historical sources, a disease moving along trade routes and waterways with startling speed. Though the genetic evidence has also revealed some surprising local variations in how different regional outbreaks unfolded, variations that suggest the pandemic's spread was somewhat more complex and less uniform than a single simple narrative can fully capture. This same body of research has also begun clarifying something historians had long suspected from the written record but struggled to confirm with real precision: the fact that this 14th century catastrophe was not in fact a single isolated event, but rather the opening chapter of a much longer pattern of recurring outbreaks that would continue affecting European populations for centuries afterward. Genetic samples recovered from burial sites dating to later decades and even later centuries show clear evidence of the same bacterial lineage continuing to circulate and periodically resurge, sometimes with devastating local effect long after the initial catastrophic wave had passed through a given region. Understanding this longer pattern has helped researchers place the 14th century outbreak in a broader context, not as a single unrepeated disaster, but as the first and by far the most severe episode in what would become for many generations of Europeans who came after Thomas and his contemporaries a recurring and deeply feared feature of ordinary life. Modern genetic research has also begun to shed light on a question we touched on earlier. In this, the puzzling pattern. 14th century observers noticed but could not explain in which some survivors of earlier infections seemed to gain lasting protection against the disease. Researchers studying the genomes of modern human populations descended from regions heavily affected by this outbreak have identified certain inherited genetic variants related to immune system function that appear at notably higher frequencies in these populations compared to populations whose ancestors were less affected by the pandemic. This suggests, though, the evidence here remains an active and ongoing area of scientific investigation that the catastrophic mortality of this outbreak may have exerted genuine evolutionary pressure on the surviving human population, favouring certain immune system variations that offered even a slight survival advantage, a sobering reminder of just how profound and lasting this catastrophe's impact on the human species actually was written not only into the historical record, but into the genetic inheritance carried by millions of people living today, most of whom have no idea that a piece of their own biology was shaped by a village mourning very much like the one where Thomas first fell ill. One study examining this particular genetic legacy compared immune-related genes across large populations of modern descendants from heavily affected regions against similar populations whose ancestors experienced comparatively lighter losses during the outbreak. Researchers found that certain gene variants associated with a stronger inflammatory immune response appeared significantly more common among descendants of the hardest-hit populations, a pattern consistent with those variants having offered a genuine, if partial, survival advantage during the outbreak itself. This same research intriguingly also noted that some of these same immune variants are associated today with a somewhat elevated risk of certain autoimmune conditions, a poignant illustration of how evolutionary trade-offs made under the extreme pressure of a medieval catastrophe continue to echo in small and largely invisible ways through the health of people living 7 centuries later, most of whom will never learn the reason why their own immune system happens to be built the way it is. What began as a private family tragedy in one small English household, and thousands of similar tragedies unfolding, simultaneously across an entire continent has become, through the patient and careful work of modern science, one of the most thoroughly documented and scientifically understood catastrophes in all of human history. And yet, for all this genetic clarity, some of the deepest questions surrounding this outbreak questions about exactly how many people actually died and how those numbers varied from region to region remain surprisingly difficult to answer with real precision. A puzzle that historians and demographers continue working through, even now using every scrap of evidence, written and genetic alike, that this long and patient investigation has managed to recover. Ask 10 different historians exactly how many people died during this catastrophe and you will likely receive 10 somewhat different answers, not because any of them are careless with the evidence, but because the evidence itself resists the kind of precise counting we might instinctively expect from an event of this magnitude. The most commonly cited figure repeated across countless popular accounts of this history suggests that roughly a third of Europe's population died within the space of a few catastrophic years. This estimate is not simply invented or arbitrary. It emerges from decades of painstaking work by historians and demographers piecing together fragments of surviving evidence from an era that never conducted anything resembling a modern census. Manorial records, which track the tenants working a lord's land and the rents and services they owed, offer one of the more reliable windows into population change, since a sudden sharp drop in the number of tenant names appearing in these records provides a rough but genuinely useful proxy for mortality within a given community. Similarly, records of probate, the legal process for settling a deceased person's estate, show dramatic spikes during the outbreak years in nearly every region where such records survive, sometimes showing 10 or 20 times the normal annual volume of wills being processed within a matter of months. It is worth noting that the commonly cited figure of roughly 1/3 has in more recent decades come under genuine scholarly reconsideration, with a meaningful number of historians now arguing that the true mortality across much of Europe may have been considerably higher, in some regions approaching half of the population rather than a third. This shift in scholarly opinion did not emerge from any single dramatic discovery, but rather from the slow accumulation of more detailed regional studies, each one adding refined local evidence to a picture that earlier generations of historians working with less complete records had perhaps somewhat understated. Scholars still actively debate exactly how far this upward revision should extend across the continent as a whole, since the evidence supporting higher mortality estimates is considerably stronger for some regions than others, and applying findings from one well-documented area to the whole of Europe risks a kind of overconfident generalization that careful historians are understandably reluctant to make. Church records, particularly those tracking the appointment of new clergy to fill vacant church positions, offer another valuable, if imperfect, source of evidence. Bishops kept detailed registers recording when a parish position became vacant and who was appointed to fill it, and historians studying these registers across several English dioceses have found staggering spikes in clergy appointments during the outbreak years, spikes that closely track the kind of mass mortality described in narrative chronicles from the same period. One diocese in the east of England shows nearly half of its parish positions changing hands within a single 18-month period, a statistic that translated into human terms suggests something close to half of that region's parish priests died, or otherwise vacated their positions during this brief and terrible window. Economic records offer yet another somewhat unexpected angle on this same question. Historians studying surviving records of wages and grain prices across England and parts of continental Europe have found that both began shifting noticeably in the years immediately following the outbreak, with agricultural wages rising, and in many regions the price of grain relative to labour beginning a long, gradual decline. This pattern makes intuitive sense once we understand what had happened to the underlying population. With dramatically fewer labourers available to work, the land's surviving workers found themselves in a position to demand higher pay, while a smaller population overall meant somewhat less pressure on the fixed supply of arable land and stored grain. Economic historians have used these wage and price trends as an independent check on the population estimates derived from manorial and probate records, and the two forms of evidence broadly corroborate each other, lending additional confidence to the overall picture, even where any single source taken alone might leave room for doubt. And yet for all this careful evidence arriving at a single confident number for total mortality across the whole of Europe remains genuinely difficult, and historians continue to debate the matter with real, scholarly seriousness, rather than settled consensus. Some regions have left behind far more detailed records than others, meaning our confidence in mortality estimates varies considerably depending on location. England and parts of Italy, thanks to relatively well-preserved administrative records, offer historians in somewhat firmer ground to stand on than, say, large stretches of Eastern Europe or the Iberian Peninsula, where surviving documentation from this exact period is considerably sparser. This creates an uneven picture, one where historians know a great deal about mortality in certain well-documented regions, and must rely on more cautious extrapolation when estimating figures for the continent as a whole. Mortality also appears to have varied considerably based on factors beyond simple geography, and historians studying this variation have identified population density as one of the more consistent predictors of just how devastating a given community's experience turned out to be. Crowded urban centres where households often lived in close physical proximity, and where rats and fleas found abundant opportunity to move between homes, generally recorded higher mortality than more sparsely populated rural villages, though rural communities were far from spared, as Thomas's own small village makes clear. Some historians have also pointed to pre-existing vulnerability from earlier famines that had struck parts of Europe in the decades immediately preceding this outbreak, arguing that populations already weakened by earlier nutritional hardship may have proven somewhat more susceptible to severe illness once this new catastrophe arrived, though this remains an area where scholars continue to weigh competing evidence rather than reaching full agreement. Beyond Europe's borders, the picture historians must reconstruct becomes considerably harder still, and this is a part of the story that deserves more attention than popular accounts of this history typically give it. The outbreak that devastated Europe was in fact part of a much larger pandemic that swept across large stretches of the Middle East, North Africa and Central Asia during roughly the same years, affecting cities from Cairo to Damascus to Baghdad, with a severity that surviving Arabic chronicles describe in terms every bit as devastating as anything recorded in Florence or London. Cairo, then among the largest and most sophisticated cities in the entire world, appears to have suffered mortality on a scale comparable to or exceeding the worst European outbreaks, with contemporary accounts describing thousands of deaths recorded daily during the worst weeks of the crisis there. Because so much popular historical memory in the West has understandably focused on European sources and European consequences, this broader, genuinely global scope of the catastrophe often receives far less attention than it deserves, even though the surviving evidence makes clear that this was never a purely European tragedy, but rather one of the most widespread and simultaneous demographic catastrophes in the whole of recorded human history, touching societies across 3 continents within the span of a single decade. There is a detail about this evidence that surprises many people encountering this history for the first time. Some of the most valuable evidence for estimating overall mortality does not come from any written record at all, but from something considerably more indirect: the physical landscape of medieval England itself. Historians and archaeologists studying the period have identified hundreds of what are known as deserted medieval villages, settlements that appear clearly in earlier records and on the physical landscape, complete with visible earthworks marking where houses, streets and church foundations once stood, but which simply vanish from the historical record sometime during or shortly after the outbreak years. Not every one of these abandoned settlements can be attributed directly to plague mortality, since villages were sometimes abandoned for other economic reasons across the medieval period, but the sheer concentration of these disappearances occurring within a narrow window immediately following the worst years of the outbreak offers historians as a powerful physical form of evidence quite literally written into the landscape itself for just how thoroughly this catastrophe emptied certain communities. I find myself thinking when I consider this particular kind of evidence about how strange and quietly moving it is that some of our clearest confirmation of this catastrophe's scale comes not from anything anyone deliberately wrote down, but from the simple accumulated silence of places that used to have people in them and quite suddenly no longer did. A village that appears on a tax record one year and vanishes from every subsequent record tells its own kind of story, one that requires no chronicler's pen to convey its weight. Some of these deserted villages have themselves become subjects of careful modern archaeological investigation, and what researchers find when they excavate them often deepens rather than simplifies our understanding of what actually happened. One such site in the English Midlands, excavated over several seasons by university researchers, revealed a community that appears, based on the evidence recovered, to have persisted in a much reduced form for several decades after the initial outbreak before finally being abandoned entirely, its remaining few households likely relocating to a nearby town rather than the entire population dying at once in a single catastrophic event. This kind of detailed, patient archaeological work has taught historians an important lesson about how these depopulation events actually unfolded less often as a single dramatic disappearance and more often as a slow, grinding decline, a community losing just enough of its population and just enough of its economic viability that continuing to exist in its original form eventually became impossible, even if that final ending took years rather than weeks to arrive. Beyond the question of overall numbers, scholars also continue to debate a related and genuinely fascinating question: whether every death attributed to this outbreak was actually caused by the same disease, or whether the catastrophic conditions of the period widespread famine in the years immediately preceding the outbreak. The total breakdown of normal sanitation and food distribution during the crisis itself, and the sheer psychological and physical stress of living through sustained catastrophe might have contributed to mortality from other causes, entirely deaths that contemporary chroniclers working without any modern diagnostic tools would have simply folded into the same general category of plague death. This question matters for historians trying to understand not just how many people died, but precisely why, and untangling the specific contribution of the primary disease from these compounding factors remains an active and genuinely open area of ongoing historical and epidemiological research. This same question has taken on renewed importance in light of the genetic evidence we spent time with earlier, since researchers now working with skeletal remains can in some cases directly test whether a given individual actually carried the specific bacterium responsible for the outbreak, rather than relying solely on circumstantial evidence like burial timing and location. This more direct method of confirmation has in most cases studied so far supported the traditional understanding that the great majority of deaths recorded during the outbreak years genuinely resulted from this specific disease rather than some combination of unrelated causes. It has also in a smaller number of individual cases revealed something more complicated remains from mass graves associated with this period that show no genetic trace of the pathogen at all. Individuals who may have died of entirely unrelated causes during a period of such general chaos and overwhelmed burial systems that they were interred alongside plague victims, regardless of their actual cause of death. Historians studying these findings caution against reading too much into any single such case, since the genetic evidence itself carries real limitations, including the simple fact that not every infection leaves a detectable genetic trace even in a person who genuinely died from it, but the finding nonetheless adds useful nuance to a picture that popular accounts of this history sometimes present with more certainty than the underlying evidence actually supports. Does it actually matter in the end whether the true mortality figure for a given region was closer to a quarter of the population or closer to half? I think it does, though. Perhaps not in the way we might first assume. The precise number matters enormously for historians while trying to understand exactly how different regions experienced and recovered from this catastrophe, since even modest differences in mortality rate translated into very different trajectories for how quickly a given region's economy, social structure, and population eventually rebuilt themselves in the decades that followed. Regions that lost closer to a quarter of their population often show evidence of somewhat faster social and economic recovery in the surviving records communities able to reconstitute something resembling their previous structure within a single generation, while regions where losses approached or exceeded half show far more dramatic and lasting transformation. Entire patterns of land use, settlement, and social organization reshaped in ways that persisted for a century or more afterward. But for understanding the human experience of living through this event, the precise figure matters somewhat less than the simple, overwhelming fact that shapes every account we have examined throughout this story. Whether the true figure was 1 person in 4 or 1 person in 3, this was a catastrophe on a scale that no one living through it had any precedent for, and no one living through it could have confidently predicted when or whether it would ever end. What historians can say with genuine confidence, despite all this uncertainty around precise figures, is that this outbreak stands by any reasonable measure among the deadliest events in recorded human history, whether measured in absolute numbers of dead or, more strikingly still, in the proportion of an entire continent's population lost within a span of just a few catastrophic years. This confidence rests not on any single perfect source, but on the remarkable, quiet convergence of so many independent and imperfect ones: manorial rolls and probate spikes, clergy registers and grain prices, abandoned villages and genetic evidence recovered from teeth buried for 6 centuries each, imprecise on its own, each pointing together toward the same unmistakable conclusion. Few events in the whole of human history, before or since, have altered the trajectory of an entire civilization so quickly and so completely. And it is to that altered trajectory, the world this catastrophe left behind once its worst and most immediate dying had finally mercifully begun to subside, that our story now turns. There is an old economic principle, obvious enough once stated plainly, that when the supply of something falls sharply while demand for it remains largely unchanged, the price of that thing rises. What makes this particular moment in history so striking is that the something in question was human labor itself, and that the shift in its price would end up reshaping the entire structure of European society for generations to come. We touched briefly earlier in this story on how quickly wages for surviving laborers began climbing once the worst of the immediate mortality had passed. I want to slow down now and look more closely at what this actually meant in practical terms for the people living through it, and at how thoroughly it upended assumptions about labour land and social order that had held largely steady across Europe for centuries. In the world that existed before this catastrophe, the great majority of rural labourers across much of Europe lived and worked within a system of obligation to a local lord tied to the land through customs and legal arrangements that had developed gradually across the medieval period. A peasant farmer typically owed a portion of his labour, his harvest, or both to the lord whose land he worked, in exchange for the right to farm a modest plot for his own family's needs, and in many cases, for a measure of legal and physical protection. This arrangement, whatever its considerable hardships, had proven remarkably stable, sustained in large part by a simple demographic reality. There were consistently more people seeking access to land and work than there was land and work readily available, which left lords holding most of the practical bargaining power in these relationships. The catastrophic mortality of the outbreak years shattered this underlying arithmetic almost overnight. With a third or more of the rural workforce suddenly gone in many regions, the surviving labourers found themselves in an entirely unfamiliar position. Lords who desperately needed hands to work their fields could no longer simply assume a ready supply of workers content with traditional arrangements. Some peasants began quietly testing this new leverage, abandoning tenancies that offered poor terms and moving sometimes considerable distances toward lords or landholders, willing to offer better wages, reduced obligations, or outright freedom from traditional feudal bonds in exchange for their labour. Landholding authorities across Europe did not accept this shift passively. In England, within just a few years of the outbreak's worst devastation, the Crown issued formal legislation attempting to freeze wages at their pre-outbreak levels, making it a punishable offence for labourers to demand higher pay, or for employers to offer it, and further restricting the ability of peasants to leave their traditional place of residence in search of better opportunities elsewhere. This legislation and similar measures enacted across various other parts of Europe during the same period reveal something important about how ruling authorities understood what was happening. They recognize with real clarity that the fundamental economic leverage between labourers and landholders had shifted, and they moved quickly and deliberately to try to legislate that shift back out of existence. It did not work, at least not for very long, and the reasons why offer one of the more instructive threads running through this entire history. Wage laws of this kind proved extraordinarily difficult to enforce across a landscape where labour was desperately needed everywhere, and where individual landholders competing with their neighbours for a shrunken pool of available workers frequently found it more practical to quietly violate these regulations than to leave their fields unworked and their harvests unbrought. Scholars still debate exactly how widely and how consistently these wage restriction laws were actually enforced across different regions, since the surviving court records show considerable local variation, with some areas prosecuting violations with real regularity, and others apparently treating the legislation as largely aspirational. What is clear, regardless of enforcement inconsistency, is that wages for agricultural and skilled labour across much of Europe continued their upward climb throughout the following decades, official prohibitions notwithstanding, a testament to just how powerful the underlying economic pressure had become. There is a related and rather surprising thread to this same legislative response, one that reveals just how deeply this shift in labourers' economic standing unsettled the traditional social order. Alongside wage restrictions, several English and continental authorities during this period passed what historians now refer to as sumptuary laws, regulations attempting to dictate what types of clothing, fabric, and personal ornamentation different social classes were legally permitted to wear. These laws emerged directly in response to a genuinely new phenomenon. With wages rising sharply, some labourers and artisans suddenly found themselves able to afford fine cloth, fashionable colours, and small luxuries that had previously been reserved in practice, if not always in explicit law, for the gentry and nobility. Authorities found this deeply troubling, not primarily for economic reasons, but because clothing in medieval society served as a visible marker of social rank, and a labourer, dressed indistinguishably from a member of the lesser gentry, represented to anxious traditional authorities a visible and unsettling symbol of a social order coming undone. Scholars studying these sumptuary laws note that they proved, if anything, even harder to enforce than the wage restrictions themselves, since policing what ordinary people chose to wear required a level of surveillance and intervention that medieval authorities simply did not have the practical capacity to sustain. This growing tension between traditional authority and a suddenly empowered labouring class did not remain confined to quiet, gradual economic negotiation. It eventually erupted into open and, in some cases, quite dramatic conflict. In England, several decades after the outbreak's initial devastation, simmering resentment over wage restrictions, unpopular taxation, and the continued insistence by landholding authorities on enforcing traditional feudal obligations that many labourers now considered obsolete, boiled over into a major popular uprising with tens of thousands of common people marching on London itself, briefly overwhelming the city's defences and forcing direct negotiations with the young king. This revolt was ultimately suppressed and many of its leaders executed, but historians studying the period broadly agree that it represented a genuinely significant moment in the longer, slower transformation of English rural society, a visible eruption of pressures that had been building steadily in the decades since the outbreak first upended the traditional balance between lords and labourers. Similar unrest born from broadly comparable economic pressures surfaced in various forms across continental Europe during these same decades, though rarely with quite the same dramatic scale as the March on London. Rural and urban labourers in parts of France and the Low Countries staged their own periodic uprisings and work stoppages during this period, generally provoked by some combination of taxation, wage disputes, and lingering resentment over traditional obligations that increasingly struck ordinary people as unjust given how thoroughly the underlying economic reality had shifted in their favour. None of these individual uprisings succeeded in permanently overturning the existing political order, and most were suppressed sometimes with considerable brutality by the authorities they challenged. But taken together across the whole of Europe, this pattern of recurring unrest across multiple regions and multiple decades tells us something important: that the tension unleashed by this demographic catastrophe was not confined to any single country or any single dramatic episode, but represented a genuinely continental phenomenon, playing out with local variation in dozens of different communities across the whole of the affected region. I find it worth pausing on how directly this later uprising connects back to the catastrophe we have spent so much of this story exploring. The people marching on the London in this later rebellion were not for the most part personally old enough to remember the worst years of the outbreak firsthand. Many had been born after it into a transformed economic landscape their parents and grandparents had helped create through decades of quiet, persistent negotiation and, when necessary, outright defiance of laws meant to hold the old system in place. The catastrophe itself had passed, but its consequences continued rippling forward, reshaping the expectations and demands of an entire generation who had grown up in its long economic aftermath, beyond wages and labour mobility. This same period saw a genuine, if gradual, transformation in the underlying structure of rural landholding across much of Europe. Traditional feudal obligations, which had tied peasant families to specific parcels of land and specific duties owed to a local lord, began eroding sadly in the decades following the outbreak, replaced increasingly by more flexible arrangements involving cash rents and negotiated labour contracts. This shift did not happen everywhere at the same pace, and some regions retained elements of traditional feudal structure considerably longer than others, but the overall trajectory across much of Western Europe moved steadily away from the rigid hereditary obligations that had defined rural life for centuries before this catastrophe towards something closer to a genuine, if still deeply unequal, labour market. It is worth noting that this trajectory was far from universal, and the divergence that emerged between different regions of Europe during these same decades offers one of the more instructive comparisons available to historians and studying the outbreak's long-term social consequences. In much of Western Europe, the labour shortage genuinely empowered peasant communities eroding feudal obligation in the manner just described. In large parts of Eastern Europe, by contrast, the same demographic catastrophe produced over the following generations something closer to the opposite outcome: as landholding nobility in regions such as Poland and areas further east responded to labour scarcity not by offering better terms to attract workers, but by tightening legal restrictions, binding peasants more rigidly to the land, a process that historians studying comparative European social history have come to see as one of the more striking and consequential divergences to emerge from this single shared catastrophe. Exactly why Western and Eastern Europe responded to essentially the same demographic shock in such different ways remains a genuinely debated question among economic historians, with explanations ranging from differences in urban development and market access to variations in existing legal and political structures, though no single explanation has achieved full scholarly consensus. There is a detail from this period that surprises many people, one that speaks to just how thoroughly the outbreak's demographic shock rippled into areas of life that might not immediately seem connected to labour and land. With so many households losing family members, inheritance patterns across much of Europe shifted in ways that occasionally offered unexpected opportunities to people who would, under ordinary circumstances, have had little claim to property or independent economic standing. Widows in particular sometimes found themselves inheriting and managing substantial property and business interests that would previously have passed to a surviving husband or eldest son out of simple demographic necessity, rather than any deliberate change in the legal or cultural status of women. Historical records from several English and Italian towns during this period show women appearing as independent property holders, guild members, and business operators in numbers that stand out noticeably from the decades immediately preceding the outbreak evidence. Though the pattern varied considerably by region and did not represent anything like full economic equality of how thoroughly catastrophic mortality could disrupt even deeply entrenched social hierarchies, at least temporarily, simply by leaving behind gaps that someone regardless of gender needed to fill. Urban guilds, the associations of skilled craftsmen that regulated trades in most medieval cities, felt this same demographic pressure in their own particular way. With so many master craftsmen dead and with training a new generation of skilled workers requiring years of apprenticeship that the crisis had badly disrupted, several guilds across England and continental Europe found themselves out of practical necessity rather than any change in guiding philosophy, admitting women into roles and trades that had previously been reserved almost exclusively for men. Those of guildmasters in particular were sometimes permitted to continue operating their late husband's workshop and business, a practical accommodation that would have seemed unthinkable under the ordinary demographic conditions that had prevailed before the outbreak. This shift, like so much of the social transformation unleashed by this catastrophe, proved neither permanent nor uniform, and many of these expanded opportunities for women narrowed again in the generations that followed, as the population gradually recovered and traditional social pressures reasserted themselves. But for a meaningful stretch of decades, the sheer scale of loss had genuinely cracked open doors that had previously been kept firmly closed. What might it have felt like for a labourer's son who had grown up hearing his grandparents describe a world of rigid obligation and limited opportunity to suddenly find himself negotiating wages directly with a desperate landholder, or considering a move to a distant town offering better terms than his own village could provide? We cannot know the precise interior experience of any single such person, since the surviving records tell us about wages and legal disputes rather than personal reflection, but historians studying this period have noted with genuine interest how quickly expectations around social mobility and economic opportunity appear to have shifted within just a generation or two of the outbreak's worst devastation, a remarkably fast transformation in the underlying assumptions that had structured rural European life for centuries beforehand. Not everyone experienced this transformation as opportunity. For landholding families accustomed to the traditional advantages of feudal authority, the erosion of these old certainties represented a genuine and in many cases deeply resented loss of status and control. Surviving letters and legal petitions from members of the landholding class during this period frequently express real anxiety and frustration at what they experienced as a fundamental breakdown of proper social order. Labourers who no longer knew their place, tenants who negotiated terms rather than simply accepting what was offered, a world that seemed to those who had benefited most from the old arrangements to be coming apart at the seams. This tension between those who gained new leverage and those who lost traditional authority would continue shaping European social and political conflict for generations to come, and its roots trace directly back to the demographic catastrophe we have spent so much of this story exploring. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete regarding exactly how much of the broader social and economic transformation that unfolded across the following century can be attributed directly to this single catastrophic outbreak as opposed to other contributing factors already at work in European society before its arrival. Historians continue debating the precise weight this catastrophe should carry in the larger story of Europe's gradual transition away from strict feudal organization toward more flexible economic and social arrangements, since several other forces, including ongoing warfare, technological change, and shifting patterns of trade, were also exerting real pressure on European society during roughly this same period. What seems clear even amid this ongoing scholarly debate is that the outbreak accelerated and intensified changes that might otherwise have unfolded far more slowly, compressing what might have taken several centuries of gradual pressure into a handful of transformative decades. As we move forward now toward the broader question of exactly what kind of world this catastrophe ultimately left behind, it is worth carrying with us this particular thread. The quiet, persistent way that ordinary people, labourers and widows and tenant farmers who left behind no grand chronicles of their own, nonetheless helped reshape an entire continent's social and economic structure simply by responding in thousands of individual practical decisions to a world that had suddenly, catastrophically run short of hands. Catastrophe of this magnitude does not simply pass through a civilization and leave it unchanged underneath. It leaves marks in places far quieter and more lasting than tax records and wage laws in the art people made the stories they told, the questions they began asking about faith and mortality that their grandparents would never have thought to ask at all. Consider first what happened to European art in the decades following this catastrophe, a shift so pronounced that historians studying the period can often identify with reasonable confidence whether a particular painting or sculpture was created before or after the outbreak simply by examining its subject matter and tone. Religious art before this period had certainly engaged with themes of death and mortality as any medieval Christian art naturally would, but a new and considerably more visceral preoccupation with physical decay and the immediacy of death began appearing across painting, sculptures, and architectural decoration throughout the affected regions. Artists began depicting skeletal figures leading the living in dance, kings and beggars alike drawn along in the same procession toward an identical fate. An image that art historians have come to call in later centuries the dance of death, and which appears with striking consistency across church walls, printed woodcuts, and even elaborate tomb sculptures throughout much of Europe in the years and decades following the outbreak. A related and equally distinctive artistic tradition often referred to by scholars using a Latin phrase meaning, "Remember that you must die," emerged and flourished during these same decades, encouraging viewers to reflect regularly and deliberately on their own eventual mortality as a spiritual and moral discipline. Paintings and small devotional objects incorporating skulls, hourglasses, and wilting flowers, symbols intended to remind the viewer of time's relentless passage and life's fundamental brevity, became increasingly common across households wealthy enough to commission private devotional art, a genuinely new category of everyday religious object that historians of material culture trace directly to the psychological aftermath of this period. What strikes me about this particular tradition is how it transformed an experience of overwhelming, involuntary loss into something closer to a chosen spiritual practice, an attempt, however imperfect, to make deliberate meaning out of a mortality that had for an entire generation arrived without any warning or meaning at all. This new artistic preoccupation extended into how the wealthy chose to memorialize themselves after death. A new style of funerary monument emerged during this period, showing the deceased not in the dignified, idealized pose common to earlier medieval tomb sculpture, but instead as a decaying corpse, worms and decomposition rendered in careful, unflinching detail directly beneath a more conventional effigy of the same person in life. These so-called transy tombs, commissioned by bishops, nobles and wealthy merchants across England and continental Europe, represent something genuinely new in how people chose to be remembered, an insistence on confronting physical mortality directly, rather than softening or avoiding it, a shift in sensibility that art historians trace directly back to the psychological aftermath of living through or growing up in the immediate shadow of this catastrophic mortality event. I find this particular development quietly fascinating because it suggests something about how an entire culture processes trauma on a scale too large for any individual grief to fully contain. Rather than turning away from images of death, European art in this period turned toward it almost obsessively, as though the only honest response to what had happened was to keep the reality of mortality visibly insistently present, refusing the kind of comfortable denial that might otherwise have let an earlier, more idealized artistic tradition simply continue as though nothing had changed. This same cultural reckoning with mortality found expression well beyond formal religious art, extending into how ordinary people across much of Europe organized their daily lives and personal priorities in the decades following the outbreak. Surviving wills and personal letters from this period show a noticeable increase in charitable bequests, endowments for hospitals, almshouses, and educational institutions established by merchants and minor gentry who had in many cases personally survived the catastrophe or lost close family members to it. Historians studying these charitable patterns have suggested, with appropriate caution given the difficulty of establishing motivation from documents this many centuries old, that surviving a catastrophe of this magnitude may have prompted a genuine and widespread re-evaluation of how people wish to be remembered and what obligations they felt toward their surviving communities, a pattern of institutional generosity that, whatever its precise psychological origins, left a lasting and genuinely beneficial mark on European civic life that persisted for generations after the individual donors themselves had died. Religious life itself, beyond the specific artistic imagery it produced, underwent a quieter but genuinely significant transformation in the decades following the outbreak. We discussed earlier how the catastrophe strained the institutional church, from the devastating mortality among parish clergy to the flagellant movement's brief but intense challenge to established religious authority. This strain did not simply resolve once the immediate crisis passed. Historians studying religious life in the decades following the outbreak have identified a noticeable increase in more personal, individually focused forms of devotion, mystics and religious writers producing works intended for private reading and reflection, rather than solely for participation in formal communal church ritual. Several of the most influential religious writers of the following century, women among them, produced deeply personal accounts of spiritual experience and divine encounter that circulated widely among literate lay people hungry for a more immediate, less institutionally mediated relationship with their own faith, a genre of devotional writing that flourished with particular intensity in the decades following the outbreak's worst devastation. Scholars still debate exactly how directly this shift toward more personal religious experience can be attributed to the outbreak itself, since several other cultural and intellectual currents were also reshaping European religious life during roughly the same period. but the timing and the frequent explicit references within these devotional texts to themes of mortality, divine judgment, and the fragility of earthly life suggest a meaningful connection that few historians studying the period are willing to dismiss entirely. There is a detail from this broader religious transformation that surprises many people encountering it for the first time, one connecting this history directly to changes that would eventually reshape European religious life on a much larger scale. The devastating mortality among educated clergy which we discussed earlier, when examining the strain placed on parish institutions, had a lasting consequence that extended well beyond the immediate crisis. A persistent shortage of well-trained, theologically sophisticated priests across many regions of Europe for decades afterward, as the Church struggled to rebuild its educational infrastructure quickly enough to replace everything the outbreak had taken. Some historians studying the origins of later religious reform movements have pointed to this prolonged period of reduced clerical education and authority as one contributing factor among several that helped create conditions in which ordinary laypeople grew increasingly comfortable engaging directly with religious texts and ideas, rather than relying exclusively on a well-trained clergy whose numbers and expertise had been so severely depleted. This remains a genuinely debated point among historians of religion. Since the later reform movements in question emerged more than a century after this outbreak, and were shaped by numerous other factors entirely unrelated to it, but the connection, however partial and indirect, offers a striking illustration of how a single catastrophic event can send ripples forward across generations in ways its contemporaries could never have anticipated. Universities themselves, the great centres of formal medieval learning, faced their own considerable rebuilding after the outbreak's worst years, and the shape that rebuilding eventually took carried its own quiet significance. Several university faculties, medicine chief among them, emerged from this period of forced reconstruction with a renewed and increasingly explicit emphasis on direct clinical observation, careful record-keeping of symptoms and outcomes, and cautious skepticism toward inherited theoretical frameworks that had so visibly failed to explain or address the catastrophe just experienced. This shift did not amount to anything like a full scientific revolution, which still lay several centuries in the future, and most medical teaching continued operating within the same humoral framework we discussed earlier for a very long time afterward. But the increased emphasis on patient, systematic observation that historians of medicine trace to this period represents a genuinely important early step along a much longer intellectual path, one that would eventually lead across many subsequent generations of careful incremental scholarly work to the kind of evidence-based medical science capable of finally identifying 6 centuries later the actual bacterium responsible for this catastrophe in the first place. Medicine and public health, meanwhile, began a slow halting process of genuine transformation in the decades following the outbreak, driven by a hard practical experience rather than any sudden theoretical breakthrough. We touched earlier on Messina's improvised decision to turn away infected ships, an instinctive response born of desperation rather than science. Over the following decades, port cities across the Mediterranean and beyond gradually developed more formal, systematic versions of exactly this kind of protective measure, requiring arriving ships suspected of carrying disease to wait offshore for a defined period before their crews and cargo were permitted to enter the city, a practice we mentioned briefly earlier, and which would eventually spread widely enough to become a standard feature of European port administration for centuries to come. Alongside these maritime measures, several cities established dedicated facilities specifically for isolating and treating plague victims separately from the general population, an early and genuinely significant step toward the kind of organized public health infrastructure that most of us today take entirely for granted. Italian cities in particular took this institutional development considerably further over the following decades, establishing what historians consider some of the earliest examples of permanent government-administered public health authorities in European history. These bodies, staffed by appointed officials with genuine legal power to enforce isolation measures, restrict movement during outbreaks, and coordinate the burial of the dead, represented a fundamentally new relationship between civic government and the health of its citizens, one that treated disease management as a legitimate and ongoing responsibility of the state, rather than a matter left entirely to private physicians, religious institutions, or individual improvisation. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete regarding exactly how directly these specific administrative innovations trace back to lessons learned during this particular outbreak, as opposed to the recurring waves of plague that continued affecting Europe for generations afterwards, since these institutions developed gradually over several decades rather than emerging fully formed in direct response to any single crisis. The historians studying the development of European public health broadly agree that this catastrophic outbreak and the long shadow of recurring epidemics it left behind provided the essential catalyst for this entirely new category of civic institution. What strikes me most when I consider this slow accumulation of practical public health measures is how little any of it depended on actually understanding the true cause of the disease these measures were designed to combat. City officials establishing quarantine periods and isolation facilities in the decades following the outbreak still had no genuine concept of bacteria, fleas, or the specific transmission mechanisms we explored earlier in this story. They were working in essence from careful patient observation alone, noticing which practices seemed to correlate with reduced spread and gradually formalizing those practices into policy and approach that, however scientifically incomplete by our modern standards, represents a genuinely important step in the broader centuries-long human project of learning to manage infectious disease through careful observation, even in the absence of complete theoretical understanding. This same period also saw a meaningful shift in the language European intellectual and literary culture increasingly chose to use. Before this catastrophe, the most serious and prestigious forms of written work across Europe, philosophy, theology, formal history, were typically composed in a language reserved for the educated elite, largely inaccessible to ordinary people even when they could read at all. In the decades following the outbreak, a growing number of writers across England, Italy, and France began composing major literary works in their own everyday spoken languages. Instead, a shift that scholars studying this period connect at least in part to the broader social transformations we discussed earlier. An educated class disrupted and reshuffled by catastrophic mortality, and a wider audience of increasingly literate and economically empowered lay people hungry for stories and ideas presented in language they could actually understand without formal scholarly training. The very account we drew from earlier, describing 10 young Florentines sharing stories with one another while sheltering from the outbreak, was itself written in the everyday language of its author's city, rather than the more prestigious scholarly language his contemporaries might have expected for a work of serious literary ambition, a choice that helped establish an entirely new literary tradition in the language it employed. A similar pattern unfolded in England during these same decades, where an entire generation of writers began producing major literary works in English, rather than the French or scholarly Latin that had dominated serious English literature since the Norman conquest 3 centuries earlier. One of the most celebrated works to emerge from this tradition takes the form of a collection of stories told by a diverse group of travellers making a shared pilgrimage together, ordinary people from many different walks of life brought together by circumstance and asked much like those sheltering Florentines to pass their journey by telling one another stories. Scholars studying this shift in English literary language note that it coincided closely with the broader social realignments the outbreak had set in motion, a merchant class and educated laity increasingly confident in their own vernacular tongue, no longer content to leave serious literary expression entirely in the hands of a French-speaking aristocracy or a Latin-trained clergy, whose numbers, as we discussed earlier, had been so severely thinned by the outbreak's devastating toll among the educated classes. Should we think of this catastrophe then as something that simply destroyed, or as something that amid all its genuine and devastating destruction also somehow cleared space for a kind of renewal? I do not think the honest answer allows for a simple choice between these two framings. Both were true simultaneously in ways that can feel genuinely uncomfortable to hold together. Millions of individual lives, each one as real and as irreplaceable as Thomas's had been, were lost in circumstances of profound suffering that this catastrophe never asked anyone's permission to inflict. And from within that same devastation across the span of the following century, new artistic sensibilities, new religious movements, new economic and social arrangements, and new literary traditions gradually took root, shaped in countless ways, some obvious and some subtle, by a civilization that had been forced to reckon at a scale it had never previously experienced, with the fragility and brevity of human life. The world that emerged from this long shadow was not the same world that had existed before Thomas woke, or failed to wake, on that ordinary August morning in his small English village. It was a world that had been broken open in ways both terrible and unexpectedly generative, and understanding exactly what that world looked like, what it had learned, what it had lost forever, and what small persistent threads of ordinary human resilience carried forward through it all, is where our story turns to close. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a story once its loudest chapters have passed, and it is in that quiet. I think that a history like this one finally reveals what it was actually about all along. We began this story inside one small house on one ordinary morning, watching a mother climb a ladder toward a son who would not answer her call. Everything that followed, the ships turned away from Messina, the trenches dug at the edges of Florence, the physicians burning sweet herbs against air they believed had turned against them, the flagellants marching their 33 days of penance, the widows suddenly holding land and workshops that would never otherwise have passed to them, the wages that climbed and the laws that failed to hold them down, the skeletons waiting patiently in London clay for scientists who would not exist for 600 years. All of it grew outward from that same single private moment. A household discovering on an otherwise unremarkable morning that the world it trusted had quietly stopped being safe. I want to hold that thread for a moment because I think it is easy across a story this large to lose sight of how thoroughly this catastrophe was made, of nothing but individual mornings, like that one repeated an almost unimaginable number of times across an entire continent. Every statistic we have examined, every estimate of a third or perhaps closer to half of Europe's population represents not an abstraction, but a compounding of moments exactly like the one inside Thomas's small house, each one its own complete world of shock and grief and desperate loving effort, each one to the people living through it, the only thing that mattered in that instant. It is worth remembering, too, how far this same story travelled before it ever reached that small English house. A shift in rainfall on the Central Asian steppe. A flea searching for a new host once its usual one had died. Besieged trading colony on the Black Sea and the ships that fled it. A harbour in Sicily that tried too late to turn the danger away. A city of storytellers in Florence, and a pope in Avignon consulting physicians about crowds and contagion centuries before anyone would fully understand why the advice worked. Every one of these moments, scattered across years and thousands of miles, eventually converged on a single ladder, a single mother, a single name. We happened to be able to give a story that could otherwise so easily have remained a number. What this history leaves us with. I think once we have moved all the way through it is not a single lesson so much as several truths sitting together, sometimes uncomfortably the way true things about human experience often do. The first is about power and how little of it in the end this disease actually respected. Kings and cardinals died in the same weeks as field labourers and beggars. Wealth bought no reliable protection, piety bought none either. A civilization that had organised nearly everything about itself around careful inherited hierarchies of status and privilege discovered within the space of a few catastrophic years that biology simply did not recognise those hierarchies at all. This particular truth about the fragility of power in the face of something entirely indifferent to human rank feels worth sitting with a little longer than the others because it runs so directly against how most of us instinctively imagine history working. We tend to picture the past as a story shaped primarily by the decisions of powerful people, kings choosing wars, popes, issuing decrees, nobles negotiating treaties. And for long stretches of ordinary history, that picture holds reasonably well. But this catastrophe reminds us that underneath all of that carefully recorded human decision-making, something far older and far less interested in human hierarchy was quietly at work the entire time, a bacterium moving through fleas and rats and human breath according to its own indifferent biological logic, utterly unmoved by whether the body it entered belonged to someone whose name would be remembered by history, or someone whose name would vanish entirely within a generation. The second truth is about collapse and about how much more complicated real collapse actually looks than the word suggests. This was not a single dramatic ending. It was thousands of small specific failures accumulating at once, a burial system unable to keep pace, a parish left without a priest, a harvest left standing in a field because there was no one left strong enough to bring it in a village that persisted in diminished form for decades before finally quietly disappearing from the record altogether. Real catastrophe, it turns out, rarely arrives as a single blow. More often it arrives as an accumulation of ordinary systems, one after another, simply failing to hold. And yet even within that collapse, something else was quietly happening, something we spent real time with earlier in this story. Wages climbed. Old feudal bonds loosened their grip. Widows inherited workshops that would never otherwise have come to them. Labourers, for the first time in living memory, found themselves in a position to negotiate rather than simply accept. None of this made the dying acceptable or the grief any lighter for the individual families living through it. But it is worth remembering that collapse and transformation are not always opposites. Sometimes the same catastrophic pressure that breaks a system apart is the very pressure that forces something more flexible, more responsive to ordinary human need to grow up in its place. The third truth, and perhaps the one that has stayed with me most while working through this story, is about memory and about how strangely unevenly it gets preserved. Thomas left no letter, no will, no chronicle entry bearing his name, and yet he is in the truest sense real, standing in for thousands upon thousands of people exactly like him, whose deaths were recorded nowhere except in the simple fact that a village's population dropped and never fully recovered. It took the patient, decades-long work of archaeologists and geneticists examining teeth recovered from anonymous mass graves to finally give voice to people history's written record had left almost entirely silent. There is something worth sitting with in that the fact that our clearest confirmation of what happened to the ordinary people of this catastrophe came not from anyone's deliberate testimony, but from the quiet, patient evidence their own bodies left behind. Think for a moment about how many other Thomases this story never even had the chance to name. Every village that vanished from the record without explanation. Every diocese that quietly replaced half its clergy within a single terrible year. Every will scrawled in a dying hand and witnessed by whichever neighbour happened still to be standing. History remembers popes and kings by name almost as a matter of course. It remembers ordinary people only by accident, only when some fragment, Attacks roll a burial trench. A fragment of genetic code preserved in a molar happens to survive long enough for someone centuries later to go looking. And yet, in a strange way, this catastrophe did something almost no other historical event of comparable age has managed to do, because it left its mark so deeply and so physically in bone and tooth and buried village alike. It eventually forced history to look for the people it would otherwise have overlooked entirely. Most catastrophes of this age survive only through the words of the people who could write, which is to say overwhelmingly through the words of the powerful. This one survives through the bodies of everyone, powerful and powerless alike, because the ground itself kept a record that no chronicler's bias could distort or leave out. There is something almost like justice in that 6 centuries delayed, small and imperfect, but real. And the fourth truth running beneath everything else we have covered is about resilience. Though I want to be careful with that word, because I do not mean it in the easy inspirational sense it sometimes gets used. I mean something quieter and more specific. I mean the 10 young Florentines who kept telling each other stories while their city emptied around them. I mean the caregivers who stayed beside the dying, despite understanding at least in a general sense the risk of staying. I mean the merchant who buried his wife and 2 children within a single week and then, because the world still required it of him, sat down and continued his correspondence about shipping and payment. I mean the survivors whose communities began relying on them specifically to nurse the newly sick, sensing correctly, without any word for what they were sensing that something in these particular people had changed. None of this is inspiring in its way a triumphant story is inspiring. It is something else. It is simply what people do, apparently even at the absolute outer edge of what a society can endure. They keep tending to each other. They keep making meaning. They keep in whatever fragile way remains available to them, choosing not to stop being people. There is a 5th thread worth naming here as well. Quieter than the others, but no less real, and it concerns the strange uneven way that suffering on this scale eventually became something more than suffering, something the civilization could actually build with. We spent time earlier with the dance of death painted onto church walls, the transy tombs showing decay beneath dignity, the sudden hunger for stories told in ordinary language rather than the language of scholars. None of this made the original grief smaller or less real. But grief, it turns out, is not only something a society survives, it is sometimes something a society is quietly, unconsciously shaped by for generations in ways that eventually stop looking like grief at all and start looking instead like simply who a people have become. I think often working through a history like this one, about the particular danger of flattening it into either a horror story or a triumph story when it is genuinely, uncomfortably both at once. It would be dishonest to end this account by suggesting that everything worked out, that the wages rose and the widows inherited land, and therefore the catastrophe was on balance some kind of hidden blessing. It was not. Millions of people who wanted very much to keep living did not get to. Children who might have grown old surrounded by grandchildren instead became a name if they were fortunate enough to leave one at all on a manorial roll or a diocesan register, or more often no name anywhere, simply a gap where a person used to be. It would be equally dishonest, though, to leave you with nothing but that darkness, because the darkness was never the whole of what actually happened. Both things sat inside the same 6 centuries. Both things are still sitting inside them now, whenever we choose to look closely enough to see them. There is one final piece of evidence I want to leave you with, because I think it draws several of these threads together more completely than anything else in this story. Among the skeletal remains recovered from that London burial ground we spent time with earlier, researchers identified the bones of a young woman, likely in her 20s at the time of her death, buried among hundreds of others in careful orderly rows, despite the overwhelming crisis surrounding her burial. Isotope analysis of her teeth suggests she was not born in London at all, but had migrated there from elsewhere, likely drawn as so many young people were by the opportunity a great medieval city offered. Someone willing to leave home and start again. We will never know her name. We will never know what she hoped for when she made that journey, what trade she meant to learn, what life she pictured for herself in a city she must have found overwhelming and thrilling in equal measure when she first arrived. What we do know, because her bones have finally been allowed to tell us, is that she lived, that she travelled farther than most people of her time and place ever did, and that when death came for her, someone amid all the chaos and exhaustion of that terrible season still took the care to lay her down properly in a row beside her neighbours, rather than simply discarding her. I find that detail almost unbearably moving, the fact that even in the absolute worst of it, someone still cared enough to do that. Think about what that single act of care actually required in a city where the ordinary machinery of burial had already broken down many times over, where priests were dying faster than they could be replaced, where every household was managing its own private catastrophe at exactly the same moment as every other household around it. And still, someone dug a proper row. Someone laid her down with some measure of order and intention rather than simply adding her to an undifferentiated pile. We do not know who that person was. We will never know their name any more than we know hers. But their choice, small and anonymous as it was, survived 600 years waiting quietly in the London clay for someone to notice it and understand what it meant. This is, I think, as close as this history ever comes to offering something like an answer, not to the question of why this catastrophe happened, which science has now largely settled, but to the harder, older question of what a person is supposed to do when confronted with suffering too vast to meaningfully address. You cannot stop a bacterium you cannot see carried by a flea you barely notice moving through a body faster than any 14th century remedy could hope to counter. But you can still dig a proper row. You can still sit through one more night beside someone you love offering water and a cool cloth, and whatever quiet words still mean something in a moment like that. You can still, even now, choose to treat a stranger's body with the same care you would want offered to your own, even when no one is watching, even when there is no reward for doing so beyond the simple fact of having done it. That instinct, more than any single statistic or scientific breakthrough this story has traced, is what I find myself carrying forward once everything else settles into quiet. This is where I want to leave the history itself and let something quieter take over. 600 years is a long time, long enough that every person who lived through this, every physician who burned sweet herbs against air they did not understand, every priest who rang a bell for one more burial, every mother who climbed a ladder toward a child who would not answer her, has been gone for longer than anyone can meaningfully imagine. And yet here we are, still learning their names from their teeth, still finding in soil beneath modern cities the careful rows where someone once laid them down with whatever tenderness the moment allowed. Civilizations rise on the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. This is one of the quiet, necessary lies every society tells itself in order to function at all. Most of the time the lie holds well enough. Sometimes it does not. For a handful of terrible years in the middle of the 14th century, an entire continent learned exactly how thin that assumption actually was, how quickly an ordinary morning could become the last ordinary morning a family would ever share. They did not know, watching their world come apart, that it would ever be whole again. It was slowly, unevenly, changed in ways they could not have predicted and would not live to see. Fields that stood empty for a generation were eventually sown again. Villages that vanished were in a handful of places quietly rebuilt under new names by people who never knew what had once stood there. Children were born to parents who had themselves been born into grief, and those children grew up mostly unaware of exactly how close the whole fragile arrangement had once come to unravelling entirely. That perhaps is the oldest pattern in this entire story, older than the flea, older than the ship, older than the disease itself. Things fall, people grieve, And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, life finds its way back to something resembling itself again. Not the same, never quite the same, but alive. Somewhere in England tonight, rain is falling on a stretch of quiet grass where a village once stood, its name barely legible on old maps, its people long since folded back into the earth they once worked. The wind moves through grass that no one planted on purpose. A fox perhaps crosses the same ground where a mother once climbed a ladder in the grey early light, calling a name that would not answer. No one there remembers Thomas. But somewhere in the soil, in the silence, in the simple fact that the grass still grows there every spring, something of him remains. And somewhere in that same quiet something of everyone else. This story has held the physicians, the priests, the widows, the merchants, the 10 young Florentines who kept telling each other stories, the young woman laid carefully in a London grave by hands we will never know remains as well. Rain and grass and grey morning light falling now the way it always has. Falling now the way it always will.